This is a redo of March 5th, 2021. Why was 8th grade the most important school year of my life? Storytime 10. Now, I've already redone my high school story times. However, I thought I would redo one last grade-wide story time before I graduate high school next month, and I decided that it should be this one. Storytime 10 was one of the most important story times I think I've ever released. Not only did it set the stage for what modern story times sound like, but it also introduced many prominent topics in storytime that have greatly shaped who I am today. However, I would honestly say in terms of production, that was by far the worst storytime I ever released. Back then, I used to record gameplay over my voice, but I forgot to tilt my phone sideways from recording my voice over to gameplay. As a result, the gameplay window is just really small compared to the actual video width. Of course, the whole losing my place meme was also prevalent with that storytime, as I had not developed the paragraph strategy that I use today in my scripts. So therefore, I am redoing this storytime in order to fix some errors that I made in the original. I am also redoing it because I remember a whole lot more about 8th grade now than I did 7 months ago. Anyways, let's begin. Growing up is just a part of life. While it would be neat to stay young forever, life doesn't work that way. We just have to go with the flow and grow up. Many adults might recall an event or time period that they recall was when they mentally went from a child to an adult. As a young adult myself, I can recall a time period that turned me from a child to an adult. That time period was my 8th grade school year. So today, I'm going to talk about my 8th grade school year. I'm Zach, this is Storytime 40 on November 5th, 2021. So, like every other storytime that deals with a particular situation that pretty much defined the school year, I'm going to start off with a disclaimer. Depression and suicide are major topics throughout the storytime. If you don't feel comfortable listening to topics like these, or if you are prone to violent situations such as these, then do not watch this storytime. So now that that's out of the way, let's talk about where I went to school. So I went to a public middle school for middle school. It was only grades 7 and 8, as 6th grade went to an intermediate school. So you might think that there were fewer students. While yes, there were fewer students, there were still a lot of students at the school. I believe there were over 600 when I went here in 8th grade. In fact, every class I was in had 30 students, so that's a lot of people. Because so many students attended the school had to split the students into different groups. One way was by the school's architecture. The school was split between the main building, which includes the cafeteria, gym, office, as well as 7th grade, and an 8th grade building, which glaringly is where I spent most of my time throughout the school year. Another way the school divided the students was by teams. I believe there were 4 7th grade teams and 3 8th grade teams. Each team had different teachers. The team I was on for 8th grade was the Rockets. This team was kind of like the advanced team, if that's what you'll call it. It included the top 90 students. I was somewhere in the top 15 for reference, this from 7th grade. This is the team that was challenged extensively. As we're going to see throughout the school year, this was not a good thing. So let's go back a little bit to the previous school year. So 7th grade was a fantastic school year. I made many new friends, I made all A's, stress was minimal, got my first girlfriend, although I haven't had a girlfriend since, and a lot of fights broke out and a lot of drama occurred. All of this made for a fun and very exciting school year, so you bet that I was pretty hyped up for 8th grade. Unfortunately, as we'll see, this school year would be nothing like I thought it would be. So before I actually begin talking about school, I first want to mention August 23rd, 2017. This was orientation day. This is where we got to visit our classes and talk with our teachers before the first day began. We also got our schedule. However, upon receiving my schedule, I realized that this was going to be a challenging school year. The classes that I was taking were the hardest classes my school offered. My 7th grade school year was really successful. The school took notice of this and wanted to challenge me. Therefore, I took 3 high school courses throughout 8th grade. One of them was for the fall, one was for the spring, and the other was year-long. The spring semester course will not be mentioned until January. So then that's enough backstory. Let's begin with the school year. The first day of school was on August 28th. My first class was WIN. WIN stands for What I Need. This is to get help on stuff and all, but for students who made good grades, they got an enrichment WIN. I'll discuss it when we get to September. So for now, I had WIN in first block. For it, we just reviewed the rules and stuff the school outlines. So for now, it was really boring. At least it was only 45 minutes, being from 7:45 to 8:30. That brings us to first block, being World History, was the fall high school course. This course was obviously about the history of the entire world. Just not as fun as that one video by Bill Wirtz, but still a fun class nonetheless. This time period we discussed was from prehistory to 9/11. Now, initially, we did not have our normal world history teacher, so our teacher was stationed in Kuwait, as alongside being a teacher, he was also in the military. However, he had to have back surgery, which resulted in him not coming back until the last week of December. So instead, we had an intern, so this intern was really cool. She had history with my mom, as mom used to teach her gymnastics, so knowing this, you bet that she was especially nice to me, which was true. She was really nice to not just me, but really to everyone, so this made world history even easier. Now, world history was special, as it was the first time I ever took a class not fully in person. However, it wasn't a fully online class either. It was a hybrid class. What happened was that while we talked about the material and did some stuff in class, we did our learning and assignments online. We had specific tasks to get done every day. Once we finished this task, we were free to play cool math games or whatever the hell we felt like it. I always got my work done pretty early. In fact, it seemed like it was impossible to not finish early, as we didn't have too much despite the class being so long. It lasted from 8:30 to 10 o'clock. So after world history came second block. However, second block's time was pretty awkwardly scheduled. Second block lasted from 10 o'clock to 10:40. I then had PE from 10:40 to 11:30, and then lunch from 11:30 to 12. Then second block resumed from 12 to 12:40. Yeah, that is a really weird way to schedule second block. So what even was second block? Well, it was English. This was not a high school course. It was simply accelerated 8th grade English. So while still a more advanced class, it was still regular old 8th grade English. Now, like world history, there was also an intern for this class. So our original English teacher adopted a baby with heart issues. Therefore, she had to take time to be there for her baby. She will be back in October, but will leave again in November due to a tragic situation I'll get to later. Then for the second semester, she would be there the whole time. So let's talk a little bit about this intern. So I noticed that many students seemed to despise her. For me, I actually didn't despise her at all. I think the reason they didn't like her is because she wasn't our main English teacher. Something to note is that most students had her for accelerated 7th grade English. I did not have her in 7th grade. So therefore, I really wasn't used to either one's teaching style. Now, there are two very important things to discuss in regards to English. The first is daily grammar practices, or DGPs. DGPs are where every week we had a sentence and worked with grammar on it. Basically the type of shit I work with when I'm writing Storytimes, even though this was over 3 years before Storytime began. On Mondays, we had to identify parts of speech. Things such as nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, pronouns, prepositions, conjunctions, and all that other stuff. On Tuesdays, it's hard to really explain, but I'll just say that we identified with stuff like subject, direct and indirect objects, prepositional phrases, and all that other stuff. On Wednesdays, we work with clauses and sentence types. Thursdays were about punctuation, and on Fridays, we diagrammed the sentence. These were extremely easy to do, as I always did them during class, and they also were not graded based off accuracy, they were just graded if we did it. The other thing to mention in regards to English is Accelerated Reader, or AR. So this is a program that all grades up to 8th grade do in the state of North Carolina. For this program, students check out books from the school library. Then they go to this program, where they take quizzes on the books they read. Each book is worth a set amount of points. We also had AR goals. This is a goal of a certain amount of points we needed to attain every 9 weeks. I do not remember any of my goals, so instead I'll just say that they were probably something like 4 or 5 books each quarter. Each quarter was 9 weeks, so pretty much between 16 and 20 books for the whole school year, including books we read in class, as we took AR tests on those too, so that's a lot of reading. But alongside these, we also had independent novel projects, or INPs. INPs were where we had to choose a book we read throughout the quarter and do a project on it. The project had 3 parts. The first one was that we had to write a 1-page report on the book. Easy enough. The second part was more of a literary section of the project. We could choose from a variety of stuff, but the one I did for every single INP was the compare and contrast chart. This is where we had to compare and contrast our book from a different book. The third section was a visual section. Like the literary section, it had multiple things we could choose from. Every single time I chose the presentation of key points. This is extremely easy. All I had to do was bullet point all the main points into a Google slide. We ended up only doing 2 INPs, one in quarter 1 and 3. We did something else for quarter 2, and we did not do anything for quarter 4, or at least I didn't. Then at 10:40, it was time for PE. This meant that we were traveling from 8th grade building to the main building. PE was my least favorite class. The main reason is because of the teachers. These teachers were dicks. They had extremely bias towards students who participated in school sports. I should emphasize the phrase school sports, as I used to swim competitively outside of school during this time. However, I didn't play any sports for the school, so the PE teachers hated me. I also wore glasses, was about average height, I weighed less than my IQ, and I wasn't the strongest, so that made them hate me even more. These were the same PE teachers we had in 7th grade, so their hate for me didn't change. Now, every day PE pretty much worked the same. It started off by the PE teachers announcing game days for different sports, which I didn't care about since I never attended sports games, even though I got in for free since I made good grades. Then we would move on to the next part of PE, being the warm-ups. Warm-ups were the worst part of the day. They could consist of one of three things. The first thing could be dancing. So if you saw Storytime 39, you probably know that I hate dancing. However, middle school kind of taught me to hate dancing even more than I thought I would ever have. Much of our PE grade came from our warm-up, so I had to try at dancing. And believe me, this sucked. What would happen is that the teachers would pull up 3 Just Dance songs. Generally, the first dance was a single dance, the second one was a 2-person dance, where we had to find a partner, and the third one was a group of 4. Fortunately, the teachers seemed to grade us on a scale. Most people were like me, they didn't want to dance either, so the teachers would grade us in accordance with others. However, the scale wasn't exactly fair. The athletic students could receive hundreds by just hanging out in the back doing nothing. Meanwhile, people like me could easily get points taken off. So what I did was that whenever the teachers weren't looking, I didn't do anything, but when they were, I danced a little bit. I still managed to keep an A in the class at least, but still, this is always super awkward to do in front of everyone. The second could be jogging. We did this warm-up on Thursdays, so for this, we had to jog around the gym for 2 songs. Now, these songs were 80s songs, as the teachers pretty much worshiped Throwback Thursday, but they didn't play any of the good 80s songs like Africa by Toto or any of that. They instead played the most cliche songs from this time period. I'm not going to name songs since I know some of y'all might really like those songs, but just know that they were extremely stereotypical from the 80s and they played them every week. So even if you love these songs, they got really old quickly. No pun intended. The third one was by far the worst. This was Insanity. Insanity is a show where this fitness trainer does a bunch of exercises over and over. Behind him are some other fitness people. We had to do these, I can't read. What we had to do was do the exercises with him. We generally did around 2 rounds, but if the teachers were in a bad mood, then we would have to do 3. These were extremely brutal, especially for someone like me who isn't used to exercises like these. Normally after each one, I was completely out of breath. The worst part was that then, I didn't even have enough energy for the rest of PE. After warm-ups, we did a thing called intensives. Electives. Shit, I can't read. Electives were where we got to pick what we wanted to do. Each elective lasted 2 weeks, and then after 2 weeks, we got to choose something else. Every time the electives were different, although some electives did cycle back. I didn't exactly remember any electives I selected in 8th grade except one, which will be mentioned in mid-March, as it had a special circumstance that went along with it. After PE came lunch. Lunch was probably the second worst period of the day. I'll discuss it more when we get to September, as it's going to play a major role in a pretty serious situation, but all you really need to know for now is that it lasts from 11:30 to 12. I also want to mention that there is a silent lunch table. Basically, if you don't do your work or you do something stupid, then you go here as punishment. I never was sent here for anything, although I did sometimes put myself here voluntarily for the same reason why lunch was the second worst period of the day. Once again, more on that later. Then at 12 o'clock, we headed back to the 8th grade building and finished second block. At 12:40, we left and began third block. Third block was Algebra 1, or Algebra as I'll call it. It was my year-long high school course that I was taking. This is only for the top 60, so the top 61 through 90 had 8th grade math. This is also probably the hardest class I ever took in my entire academic career. There are 3 reasons for that. One reason is because of who the course is meant for. This course is supposed to be taken in freshman year. However, I was taking it early in 8th grade since I did so well in 7th grade math. Therefore, I was completely skipping over 8th grade math. 8th grade math is critical because it is pre-algebra. This class is pretty much supposed to make Algebra 1 really easy. Most students taking Algebra 1 took 8th grade math in 7th grade. I didn't, so pretty much everything taught in this class was foreign to me. Yikes. Another reason was because of the workload. Never have I ever taken a class that had this much homework. Each night we had about 3 pages of homework. That translates to roughly 40 problems a night. which is about 3 hours if you consider that it generally took me an hour to determine what the hell I was doing, and in 2 hours minutes to do the homework. I said 2 hours minutes in story time, that's wrong. It then took 2 hours to do the homework. That's a little bit under 3.5 hours a night. Combined with the fact that I had swim practice every day except Friday, and then I had church on Wednesdays, yeah, I was staying up late to do schoolwork. Now you might be wondering why I do not just write down random numbers. Well, the reason is that I couldn't, because homework was graded based on accuracy, so that's why I spent so much time on the homework. In fact, the homework is actually what helped me learn the material, so it was crucial, so it was a good thing that it was a lot, but at the same time, it was really bad for my mental health. We'll see that throughout the story time how that affected me. One final reason was because of its pacing. So this was an extremely fast-paced course. The reason is because alongside this course, we were also supposed to take 8th grade math as well. We were supposed to take both the 8th grade math end of grade test, or EOG, and the Algebra 1 end of course test, or EOC. However, we'll see that in mid-January, a law was passed that made our lives much easier. Now, how about we talk about the teacher some? So he was a really cool guy. Even though his homework was at times excessive, he was a fantastic teacher who tried his hardest to make sure each and every one of his students succeeded. He was also a very funny guy as well. Probably my favorite thing about him was his teaching style. So how he taught the material was that he pretty much took the notes with us. He wrote down important information on a sheet of notebook paper. He would then do examples here. I recorded down everything and wrote word by word, or number by number in this case. Even then I still struggled immensely on the homework. For the first day of class, we did pretty much an all about me assignment, where we got to record information about ourselves, but with numerical stuff. So this basically stuff like recording down how many days old we were, how many days it had been since our last birthday, etc. Our homework would be to finish the assignment. However, there was one boy who almost never did it. He will do it eventually, but you'll have to wait to see when he does it. Then at 2:10, it was time for the final class of the day, being labs. Labs were like non-core classes that we took. They each lasted a semester, except band, which lasted a full year. I did not do band since I have absolutely no musical talent whatsoever. My lab instead was Spanish. Spanish was an overall very forgettable course. Really the only thing I remember from it was that my teacher was from Venezuela and a little bit of Spanish vocabulary. I also learned how to say bitch in Spanish, but that's about it. However, there were a few memorable moments from Spanish that I'll get to later on. Then at 3 o'clock, it was time to leave. However, I didn't go back home. Instead, I rode the bus to my mom's school. Mom taught at a local elementary school, so I rode a bus over there. At first, that wasn't too much of a problem, but ironically enough in September, we'll see some conflict arise with this just like everything else. Pretty much the rest of the week was rather normal. Math was a little bit hard to get used to, since I had never had to deal with that much homework before. Yeah, right off the bat we had so much homework for this class, but that first week was pretty easy, especially for the first week. Then that brings us into September. September 2017 was one hell of a month. This was the month that really set the stage for what was going to happen this school year. It also set the other precedents for different situations that would arise later in the school year. So I think a good way to begin September is to discuss my peers. There are different groups of people I want to talk about. I'll first talk about lunch, or as I've always called it, the lunch situation. So, the reason lunch was my second least favorite period was because our school had a specific rule that stated that students were required to sit with our second block. The reason they did this is that so that nobody would be at a lunch table by themselves. But as we'll see in February, this is quite literally what happened because of this rule. Because of this rule, each second block had 4 tables. 2 were full tables, 1 not full table, and another not full table. One of the not full tables would not let me sit with them. The other table would let me sit with them. However, it was full of bullies. Therefore, this rule pretty much forced me to sit with the bullies. So I believe this table included myself and about 6 others. 2 of them were bullies, while the other 4 were friends of the bullies who didn't necessarily bully me, but they just did whatever the bullies told them. I refer to them as the minions. Now let's talk about each bully individually. The first one was a boy who was about an inch shorter than me. However, he was stronger than me, so I don't think I could have just beat the shit out of him, because I couldn't. He had very little hair, and he was mixed race. He was also on the school's football team, although I am unaware of what position he played. But if I had to guess, he was probably the football since he also had a small dent in his head. By that characteristic alone, he was probably the same football that the Patriots used in the AFC Championship 2015, since his head was deflated. So I'll refer to this kid as the football for the duration of the story time. Now, something else to note about this kid is that he was very popular. Obviously, being on the football team, every girl at our school was trying to throw their panties at him. He also had many friends who were all really popular. I refer to the people like him as the elites, since they were really popular and everyone worshipped them. So this kid could pretty much tell the other group of elites anything about me or anyone else, and they could pretty much rid us of our reputation. Then you have the other bully. Although he was not an elite, he was even ruder and even more meaner than the elite bully. He was a pale, freckled kid a little bit taller than me, although unlike the football, I could have probably beat the shit out of him, and I really wanted to as well, but I held myself back. I never allowed myself to fight him, because I know that if I did, the football or a minion would back him up. In addition, I would also get suspended, which I didn't want to happen, so I never defended myself. I just let them carry it out. I thought that they would just get bored of it, but unfortunately, it amused them every day, so they know that I would be returning to their table every day since I had nowhere to go. Anyways, for this bully, I'll call him Sir, because in April, we're going to see him try to become a knight in a not so courtly manner. However, lunch wasn't the only place that they bullied me. I had PE with them too. Because the football was on the football team, he was one of the PE teacher's favorite students. As a result, if the PE teacher saw him insult me or something, they wouldn't bat an eye. Although had I done something, I probably would have received an after-school detention or even an in-school suspension. Once again, the bias is there. PE also included half of all 8th graders, so he could have gotten some of the school to pick on me in just one period. Yeah, that's a lot. But bullying was not just exclusive to lunch and PE. It was also very prevalent on the bus ride to mom's school. So I sat beside 2 boys on the bus. One of them was really cool. We never talked, but we were cool. The other one, however, was an asshole. He was a redhead, he was freckled, and he was kind of chubby. He was also a 7th grader. Now, while it might have seemed like I should have beat this Ed Sheeran looking ass, it probably would have not been a good idea. The reason is because behind us was another 7th grade bully. Although this kid was rather small, his temper was big. He kinda looked like the football, just that he had an afro. He also bullied me a lot and oftentimes made announcements to the entire bus about me. The whole bus would then laugh. However, did not do this around the boy who I was cool with. The reason is because this boy stood up for me. The bullies learned this after Ed Sheeran tried to insult my mom. The bully then threatened Ed Sheeran and told him to stop calling me names or he was going to beat his ass. Afterwards, they stayed quiet. Unfortunately, this boy only rode the bus on occasion, so I didn't have complete immunity from the bullies. So, all this bullying combined with stress from algebra and other schoolwork is what caused me to develop depression. I was now feeling pretty bad about myself and started to think that I wasn't that important. For now, it was minor, as it had really no impact on how I went about daily life. In fact, nobody would even know that I had depression until February, but do keep this in mind throughout the story time, as this is probably the most important topic of this entire school year. However, even in the early stages, depression still affected my behavior quite a lot. For one, I cussed a lot. Now, obviously, I've already said a few bad words in the story time so far, but I didn't say cuss words excessively. I generally only cuss to add extra emphasis on what I'm saying. However, I cussed excessively in 8th grade. About every other word I said was the F word. I also directed my language at others, cussing them out. Even over the slightest of things, I would cuss someone out, most of the time in PE. I did this to try to bring myself up. In the end, it was counter-effective, as it actually brought me down even more. Another one kind of correlates with the cussing, and that's being irritable. I got pretty annoyed even over the slightest of issues. Therefore, rather than being quiet and calm like I normally am, I got pretty aggressive throughout 8th grade. As an example, a kid in PE called me gay because I wasn't running fast enough while jogging. I then just douched him out, calling him a useless effing piece of shit and a failure of a human being. Even that kid didn't never speak another word. Even though he didn't speak another word to me again, it still hurts me today that I was this violent towards another human being. And in the end, I felt even worse about myself. This would develop depression and become an extreme in February. Another effect of depression was grades. My grades fell. Even though I was taking really hard courses, my grades didn't exactly fall from the difficulty of the courses. Depression had a huge effect on my grades too. More specifically, my attention. Depression caused me to have less focus, which caused me to not grasp as much information as I did in, let's say, 7th grade. So because of this, I was doing more poorly on assignments and tests. Now that that's all the way, let's talk about win. So because I made all A's in 7th grade, I got to participate in an enrichment win. In 7th grade, my win was Science Olympiad, so I decided to do the same thing in 8th grade. Science Olympiad is where there are multiple different science-like competitions. Each competition has something different with it. we got to choose which competition we wanted to participate in. The one I participated in was hovercraft. For this, we had to create a hovercraft and complete it to be the first one to reach the end. The competition was on Saturday, March 10th. However, we'll see that while I plan to participate, I never actually participated. I'll just go ahead and mention that it was because of an emergency that I'll get to later on. Now, the instructor for Science Olympiad is pretty interesting. So 3 years after this, she would actually come to my school and I would have her for chemistry in junior year. So interesting how that worked. I would also have her for the spring semester long course, which I'll discuss in January. Anyways, she was really nice. She always spoke in that tone that could soothe anyone. Like when she greets people, she would say it like, "Hi Zach, how you doing?" I loved her voice so much. So now moving on from when, let's talk about world history. So for world history, we had our first project. For this project, we had to partner up with someone and create a shield. This shield was supposed to kind of represent what the Greeks and Romans used thousands of years ago. The shield had to have artwork with things that both partners had in common. In first block, I had no friends. Luckily, there was a girl who also had no friends, so we pretty much worked together on it. Surprisingly, we had quite a lot of bit in common. Both of us wore glasses, both of us were really smart, and both of us loved writing. However, what stood out to me the most about her is that she actually really enjoyed playing video games. Only problem, we played different video games. I asked her what her favorite video game was, and she said GTA 5. When she said this, my mind just went, whoa, that's not something I would expect a 13-year-old girl to love. Meanwhile, my favorite video game is Super Mario Galaxy, so there's a huge difference in that. So on the shield, we just included the video game controller, I believe a PlayStation controller, since she played GTA 5 on a PS4. But really, the rest of the shield was pretty forgettable. All I remember was making 100 on it. I never spoke with the girl again, although now I wish I did, since she would have probably been a good friend to have in such a difficult school year. Also in world history, I did something a little bit stupid that's really funny to talk about. So in every module, or every time period if that's what you want to call it, we have a thing called a DBQ. Not to be confused with DBQs in American history from Storytime 37. These were actually completely different. Well, somewhat. What DBQs entail were that generally about 5 primary sources that each had 2 questions. We had to answer the questions from the primary sources. However, at the end, we had to do something that was quite similar to what we did for DBQs in American history. We would write an essay, but unlike giving us 2 weeks to write it, we were given an hour and a half to write it. So these essays were not that pretty. However, the essay is what tripped me up on the first DBQ. I completely ditched the essay part because it was on the back of the paper. I assumed that the paper was one-sided, so I didn't see it. So what grade did I make on this DBQ? Well, I made a 43. This was the second lowest grade I think I ever made on an assignment that I did. The lowest was in 3rd grade when I made a 25 on an assignment. But this was the lowest grade I made something in middle school. Many other students didn't do the essay either, so it seemed like everyone screwed up. As a result, we never had to do another essay again on DBQs. In English, nothing really happened throughout the month of September. Algebra, on the other hand, was pretty significant. So starting in early September, on every Wednesday, my teacher held a tutoring session after school. Well, more of a semi-tutoring session. It was actually time for us to do our homework, but we could ask him any questions we had. He also provided drinks and snacks too, and then occasionally, he provided extra credit. This meant that Wednesdays generally had less homework, which was a good thing since I normally didn't get home on Wednesdays till around 8:45. So I had both swim practice and church. None of the boys attended these either, so these were awesome. However, the interesting part about these tutoring sessions was that there was a girl who seemed to be interested in me. I did not have classes with her. She was actually taking 8th grade math, so we were doing different maths. However, she needed help on a math problem. Our teacher was working with another student, so I decided to come in and help her. Luckily, I knew exactly how to do it, so I guided her through it and she got it right. For the duration of the session, we pretty much just talked about stuff that I don't remember. This would go on every Wednesday for the rest of the school year. However, she was kind of a missed opportunity. It seemed like she had a crush on me, and unfortunately, I didn't do anything, so we never dated. The reason I never asked her out or anything was because when I was depressed, I obliged any opportunity I had. I assumed that nobody was interested in me and I was useless. I wish I did ask her out though, as not only was she cute, but I had dated her in 8th grade, then that school year would have been a whole lot easier. However, this wasn't the only girl who seemed to have an interest in me. There was another one who never talked to me, but I did hear her have a conversation with the football. So I shared all of my core classes with her. I also shared all of my core classes with the bullies and some of their minions. So we were waiting outside to go to Algebra. I was just waiting by myself. However, I overheard a conversation between her and the football. Well, I didn't hear her initial comment, but I did hear the football's reply. He said, "How the hell do you like Zach? That kid ugly as F." Of course, when I say F, I mean a 4-letter word that I won't say on Storytime. That was all that I heard, as he said it pretty loudly, but it's definitely made me happy at least. Too bad that like the girl at tutoring, I never dated her, as depression has just built inside my head and made me think I would never receive affection. Also, on the topic of peers, how about I discuss the boys group? So if you're familiar with my channel, you're probably aware of the boys. This is a triad of me, Ryan, and Robbie, although we met prior to 8th grade, as it was really 8th grade where we became closer. Me and Ryan only shared algebra together, meanwhile, me and Robbie shared English together. Initially, me and Robbie were at the same table, both of us were being harassed by the bullies. But one of the full tables was not full at the time, so Robbie moved over there, therefore keeping his sanity. He was also pretty far away, so he never got to see any of what happened at my table, therefore I was pretty much all alone in this. However, another friend outside the boys group who made 8th grade easier was a friend named Sebrin. So Sebrin was pretty popular for his YouTube channel, where he streamed GTA 5, Minecraft, and other games. We shared algebra together, and we got along pretty quickly. When I discuss a trip I went to in May, he'll be pretty important then, so keep him in mind. Now, staying on the topic of algebra, let's talk about how this class was structured. So this was an extremely fast-paced class. As mentioned before, this was both Algebra 1 and 8th grade math. We were going to talk about any 8th grade topics within the Algebra 1 curriculum, but at the end of the year, we would discuss the remainder of 8th grade topics. Therefore, content in this course went by quickly. Now, the Algebra 1 part of the class was divided into 10 chapters. I should go ahead and mention that we pretty much did stuff from a book. The first chapter was just a review of some 7th and 8th grade math topics. Stuff like mean, median, and mode, operations with negatives, ratios and proportions, and other rudimentary stuff. So therefore, this is probably the easiest chapter in the whole class. We started the second day of school. The second chapter of the class started sometime in mid-September. This was pretty much simple algebra. It was pretty much stuff like writing equations, solving for x, multi-step problems with x, absolute value, and more. When we went over the stuff, it was confusing as hell, but we incorporated this stuff so much throughout everything else that we did that eventually I got them down pat. Now, how about I talk about homework for a second? So homework was, as mentioned, a lot. The average grade I made on a homework assignment was a 75, mostly because I spent like 40 minutes analyzing my notes and determining what they meant. Even though they were only homework grades, these are what pulled my grade down. My algebra teacher noticed this, so he did what any great teacher would do and went out of his way to help me out. So every Friday, I would get about 30 minutes out of PE to have a one-on-one tutoring session with him. I loved these. Not only was I getting help with the challenging course, but I was also getting out of most of my least favorite class. So this was a really big win for me, and his tutoring sessions were very helpful, as every time we did one of these, I would always understand what he was talking about. To wrap up September, let's talk about the first of 3 fights that happened this school year. Now, if you saw Storytime 9, then you know that fights are probably my favorite topic to talk about. Just any conflict really is fun to talk about, but physical, full-fledged fights are really fun to discuss. So for whatever reason, I completely forgot that this fight happened for 4 years. However, last week, a friend of mine was showing me some videos on his phone, and we came across the video he recorded of the fight. This made me remember so much about it, as this happened on the bus. According to this video, the fight happened on September 25th, 2017. It was between 2 8th graders, both of which were about the same size. In fact, I could actually be seen in the video, as I sat in the very back while my friend, who was not my friend at the time, was near the front. This happened right in front of him, so he got the angle that included me. So it was pretty interesting seeing 13-year-old Zach in a fight video. Obviously, I was not the one fighting, but I was in the background. Anyways, the video for the fight was brutal. It started by one kid shoving the other then retaliates by punching. The kid then blocks his punch and they start throwing punches back and forth. At one time, it even looked like they were trying to shove each other's head off. The kid pushed the other, then tackled him into a seat, where they rested there. Then the bus driver just starts screaming at the top of her lungs to sit their ass down. The boys continued fighting, but now they were talking. Both of them started yelling cuss words at each other. Probably my favorite line was when one kid said that they were going to beat the other kid's ass and put him in the effing hospital. I found that funny because he literally just beat this kid's ass. So why is he saying he's going to beat his ass when he just did it? Then the bus driver parks the bus and goes ballistic on them. Her exact words were, sit down, get your ass in your seat." I did that so horribly. She said it like the your, she said it like kind kind of British, but not really. I can't really replicate that, but very rarely does a teacher cuss. So this really startled me. That kid then went directly into a seat. I also heard a kid say, "I can't take this shit no more. I'm about to mother effing go." I believe that kid was not one of the fighters, but he sat beside one of the fighters. What was the reason for this fight? Assigned seats. Yeah, these two boys fought over a damn school bus seat. I guess one of the kids wanted to sit with another, and the other didn't want him to break any rules. But they just went out anyways and ended up fighting. I don't remember their punishment, although they probably got an out-of-school suspension along with a really long bus suspension. The next fight I will talk about will not be until November. So that pretty much wraps up September. Pretty eventful month in regards to who I went to school with. So how about we move on to October? October 2017 isn't really a month that I think about too often, but quite a lot still happened this month. To start, let's talk about world history. So we did a debate type project for world history. We debated on if it was better to be a feared leader or a loved leader. We were assigned the position we had to take. This wasn't really a political discussion, so it didn't really matter that our position was selected for us. My position was feared, so therefore I along with others were chosen to do feared leaders. Each group had to create a slideshow where we each had to talk about a feared leader. Leaders in our slideshow included people like Alexander the Great, multiple pharaohs, Muhammad, and Joseph Stalin. The leader I was in charge of talking about was Genghis Khan. Khan was the leader of the Mongolian Empire back in the 13th century. Under his control, Mongolia pretty much took over all of Asia. In the process, Khan also raped a lot of women who were taken captive. Because of this, 1 in 200 people today are actually descendants of Khan. For the love side, I believe they included leaders like Queen Elizabeth I, Abraham Lincoln, Winston Churchill, although I don't think Kenya would agree with that one, and Nelson Mandela. The love side presented their presentation first, and then the feared side followed. Let's just say that mine was interesting. So in middle school, anything related to sex is funny. So when I stated that Khan raped multiple women, the whole class started laughing. Honestly, not sure why I didn't expect this reaction from a bunch of middle schoolers, but I mean, lesson learned. Afterwards came the debate part. I didn't speak during this part, and I really didn't need to. So for some reason, the technology guy at our school participated in this debate. Now, he has a background in history. He's specifically an expert on the French Revolution. Therefore, many of his arguments revolved around Napoleon Bonaparte and how powerful he was. The winner of the debate got 5 extra points on our next test. As expected, the feared side won, just because we had an expert on our side, so we all got 5 points. However, the love side still got 5 extra points too, since they tried really hard. In fact, they had this one kid who literally stood the entire time challenging our technology dude, and he was good too. Like, he actually was able to refute some of the claims made by our technology guy. So for that, I believe he actually got 10 extra points just because of that. So in reality, no team won. The only winner was him. But the technology person didn't guarantee a win for fear in each class. I believe in second block, the love side actually won, but he was still a big help. Now in English, our English teacher came back, so the intern was of course gone for now. She'll come back in November, so I'll explain what happened when we get there. Anyways, let's talk a little bit about DGPs. So while the intern knew quite a lot about grammar, she didn't exactly know how to diagram. However, our teacher was an expert at diagramming, so she taught us how to diagram sentences. However, all she required was for us to diagram the verb, subject, and direct object. Therefore, even though diagram made absolutely no sense to me, it was still way easier than, let's say, algebra homework. Also in English, we did our first IMP, so I decided to do my IMP on The Scorched Trials by James Dashner. So in 7th grade, I've read and watched The Maze Runner. Even now as a senior, The Maze Runner is both my favorite book and favorite movie. It's an incredible read, and the movie is incredible as well. But I will say, make sure to read the book before watching the movie, as that will make much more sense of the movie. Anyways, I read the sequel in 8th grade. Not as good as the first book, but it was still a really good read nonetheless. Anyways, the first part of the IMP was the book report. For this, all I had to do was handwrite it on a sheet of notebook paper. The second part was a compare and contrast. This was similar to the first part, being on a full sheet of notebook paper, just like the contents were a little different. We had to compare and contrast our book with another book. I chose to compare this book to its prequel. I simply spent half of the paper talking about their similarities and other half their differences. This is a very easy paper to write, as you can imagine. Comparing books in the same series is pretty unique in terms of comparing and contrasting. They are so similar since they are in the same series, but yet they are so different. So this made the paper extremely easy to follow. The final part of the IMP was the presentation. For this, all we had to do was create a Google slide that listed the key points of the book. We didn't have to list the main characters or do anything else, just the key points. So as a result, I made a rather ugly presentation that pretty much describes the entire plot of the Scorched Trials. Overall, while pretty sloppy, I still did pretty good on this project, especially for 8th grade me. I made 100 on it. However, that's not the only writing we did in English. We were also reading The Giver by Lois Lowry. This book is pretty difficult to explain, but it's a great book, so I definitely recommend it. I'd say the best way to put it is that it's pretty much a kid-friendly version of 1984. I hope that makes sense. Anyways, alongside of course reading the book and taking an AR quiz on it, we also had to write a literary essay. I had never even heard of a literary essay before, but the intern did a good job at explaining about it at least. And by the way, this was before our English teacher came back in October, so this was like early October. It's pretty much a 5-paragraph essay that talks specifically about a topic from a piece of literature, in this case, The Giver. For this essay, we had to answer the question, is the receiver of memory an honor or a punishment? I stated that it was a punishment, and then I listed 3 reasons why. Now, I'm not going to explain those reasons, as they include multiple spoilers, but to get the gist of it, I pretty much just compared the community that the book takes place in to North Korea. That's all you need to know. I finished writing this essay on October 19th. But that wasn't the only writing assignment we had to do. We also had to create a chapter 24 for the book. The book kind of leaves you off a cliffhanger, so we pretty much had to come up with our own ending. Like the literary essay, I won't mention mine since it has pretty much everything in it as a spoiler, but I will say that it had a happy ending. So now let's move on to algebra. So for our 3rd chapter, we talked about graphing linear equations. At first, this is really confusing for me, but as time progressed, and with a Friday tutoring session with my teacher, I eventually got it. Then came for the 4th chapter. We talked about working with linear equations, stuff like slope-intercept form, parallel and perpendicular lines, graphing absolute value equations, and probably the most useless equation to ever exist, point-slope form. Overall, very straightforward topic. Now, also in algebra, with each chapter we did something that you would probably not expect to see in a math class. Those are vocabulary words. Yeah, we had vocabulary words for a math class. But these tests are what kept my grade higher than a B throughout the year. Well, higher than a C. I made a B in algebra. While the math itself was hard, it was extremely easy to memorize the vocabulary words. Our teacher made a Quizlet for each module, and then he printed off the test directly from the Quizlet, so I studied my ass off on these. I specifically remember playing matching a lot. By the end of the school year, I held the record time on every single Quizlet. I should note that these Quizlets included all grades that my teacher has had over the years, so I held the record for every single one. The best part was that I kept every single Quizlet record for over 4 years. It wasn't until just 2 weeks ago when someone managed to beat me on the Chapter 4 Quizlet. Yeah, it took 4 years for someone to beat me. If you ask me, that's a big accomplishment, especially since there were so many other smart people in algebra as well. Even though I no longer hold the record for all the Quizlets, I still at least have the record for 9 of them, so I still have a lot of prestige on it. So then that takes us to a fundraiser our school was doing. So this fundraiser was where we had to buy any item from this one store. If we bought at least $20 worth, then we got to have a fun day. This fun day included things like rock climbing, snacks, obstacle course races, and more. Those who did not buy anything or not had enough money spent their PE and lunch period in their lab. So in my case, an extra Spanish class. I knew that the bullies and their minions were going to this, but I also knew that both Ryan and Robbie were not going to buy anything, so I pretty much decided to not buy anything. Therefore, I had a second Spanish period. This was amazing, as I got a day off of both PE and lunch, so I was really happy to have this happen. It also gave me the opportunity to work on a Spanish project. So for this project, we had to create a presentation on our assigned Spanish-speaking country. I was assigned Ecuador, a country that I couldn't even locate on a map, and a country I had never even heard of. So I simply did the research and placed it on a presentation. It was pretty easy overall. We then presented our country to the class sometime in early November. That too went really well. So overall, pretty easy, but forgettable project. I'm gonna take a water break. And so that brings me to November. So I first want to mention PE. The reason is because the second of the 3 fights I know about from the school year happened in PE. So I do not know what day this fight happened. However, my educated guess is November 9th. The reason is because we were jogging as a warm-up. That's of course Throwback Thursday, meaning this must have been a Thursday. It definitely could have not been the 23rd, since that was Thanksgiving, and the boys were also involved in this fight came back to school before Thanksgiving. So November 9th probably was the day that it happened. Anyways, as mentioned, we were jogging around the gym. I was right behind two boys. One was a 6'2" white boy, and the other was a 4'11" black dude. I'd noticed that both of them were shouting insults at one another. They were also cussing at the top of their lungs too. Then they got to the point that they were screaming in each other's faces. Then things turned physical. Both of them tackled each other. No punches were dealt, but it sure looked like they were about to happen. In a matter of seconds, every single student, which is by the way half of the entire grade, huddled around me and watched. I even remember in a particular, a girl behind me had her hands on my shoulders just so that she could see the fight. Then, after a few seconds, the PE teachers came over and started barking at the top of their lungs. The two boys were taken to the office, where each one received a 3-day suspension. Meanwhile, me and everyone else was ordered to sit back down. We then had to redo the warm-up, which sucked because we were halfway through the second song, but honestly, that fight was worth it. That was the second of the 3 fights that happened in the school year. The next one will be mentioned in late April. Now on to academics. So in English, our teacher had to leave again, leaving us with the same intern from the beginning of the year. The reason was that unfortunately, the baby she adopted passed away, so she was devastated and needed some time off, so she would not be back until January. Anyways, in November, we started our second novel. However, it worked pretty interestingly compared to when we read The Giver. Instead of reading a single novel as a class, we read multiple novels in different groups, each novel either related to the Holocaust or World War II. I was in a group with 3 girls. Our assigned novel was a book called Code Talkers by Joseph Bruchak? I don't know how to pronounce his name. This is a book about a young Navajo boy who grows up and becomes a code talker during World War II. This immensely helped the United States and the other Allied powers win World War II. He was present at many battles, including D-Day, the Battle of Iwo Jima, and the Battle of Midway. So my group was pretty lazy. They seemed to not really want to read for many days, and on days they wanted to read, they refused to let me read more than a chapter. As a result, I had to read a lot more at home so that I was on track. Now, we were also assigned a pretty big project for our book. It was an individual project, so I at least wasn't doing the whole thing for the girls. For this project, we had to pretend like we were the main character from our book. We wrote about a 3-page journal explaining what we were doing and how we were doing. We then had to decorate the book to try to make it look as old as possible, as well as to try to make it look like it was written on the battlefield. While writing the journal was the easy part, even though 3 pages at the time was pretty long for me, I knew I could do it, but the hard part was making it look old. For this, Mom helped me out. She burned the paper some, as well as put it in some kind of liquid to give it a yellowish color. This worked perfectly. My project looked really good, so I turned it in and made 100. Now, as stated earlier, Quarter 2 did not have an IEP. This is because this project took its place, so it was definitely great to not have to worry about that this quarter. In Algebra, we did Chapter 5, which is about inequalities, so for whatever reason, I did really well in this chapter. I generally made 85s and 90s on the homework, and I made a 94 on the test, so this was an easy chapter. Nothing else really happened throughout November, so let's move on to December. So December had a lot going for it. Obviously Christmas, but also plenty of other funny but also scary events happened this month as well. To start, let's talk about Algebra. So we are now on Chapter 6, which is about systems of equations. This is also an extremely easy chapter. I'm not too sure why I found substitution and elimination to be so easy, but they were. I don't really remember how to do systems of equations though, mostly because Algebra 1 was the last time I used them, but I do remember this being pretty easy. So if for whatever reason I need to remember this for college next semester, then it shouldn't be too hard. However, what's interesting about this chapter is that we didn't finish in December. No, we actually finished in like the first week of January. Yeah, I had to remember all that information between a 2-week break, but as stated, systems of equations are pretty easy, so it wasn't that bad. I still made an A on the test. Now, also in math, there were 3 really funny incidents that occurred throughout the month. The first one occurred on December 1st, so I was in world history, but then a super loud bang just happened out of nowhere. At first, I thought a school shooter just shot a gun, but turns out what happened was that the Elmo in the algebra room fell off. Nobody was at fault, it just did this suddenly. The classroom below them could hear it too, and obviously we could hear it too. The teachers then went to his room and help him out and see what went on. That day he did the notes on the whiteboard, although the next day being the 4th, the Elmo would be fixed. The second one happened just a week later on December 8th, so I was in English for PE. The intern asked me to get a dry eraser from my algebra teacher, so that's what I did. So I went there and asked him for that thing. Then a girl tried to make me look bad by asking why I didn't have one myself. The class started laughing. But then I made a comeback. I responded by saying, "Well, you're lucky that I don't have one myself, because if I did, you would be erased from existence." The whole class then made an ooh sound that then they went pretty crazy. I mean, for an 8th grader, this is a pretty good comeback, so I had that going for me that day. The third funny incident also happened on the same day. So we were in algebra, but then it began snowing. Here in the South, snow is already rare enough. We generally only get about one day in which it snows. Most of the time, that snow doesn't even stick. This generally comes in January, the coldest month of the year. So when a kid at the very back of the classroom shouted, "It's snowing and it's sticking," all of us, including our teacher, came over by the window to see. Sure enough, it was actually snowing and it was indeed sticking. Our teacher then said it was probably won't be enough to get out of school. But literally right after that day, and right after he said that, an announcement was made. School was dismissed early. All of us started cheering. Our teacher at first made a face that read, "What the hell just happened?" And then he joined us in cheering. Now, as stated earlier, I rode the bus. Buses were still running. The snow hadn't completely sticked yet, but it was going to, and they wanted the buses to run before that since the buses are horrible in snow. So I, alongside everyone else, got boarded on this bus. However, there was one person who did not get on the bus. That was our bus driver. She was expecting to drive the bus at 3 o'clock, so this of course surprised her. Therefore, she ended up arriving to drive the bus 30 minutes after all the other buses left. I remember while we were waiting on her, a bunch of people were joking around. I also heard a girl yell, "We ain't going back home." I didn't say anything, really. I just sat there. Neither Ed Sheeran nor the cool dude were there that day, so I just had a seat by myself. The bully who sat behind me had a bus suspension for something I'm not too sure about, so he wasn't there either. While we waited, the technology dude who debated for us in world history supervised the bus. Even though he had a bus license, he didn't drive the bus that day. Which, I mean, he could have, but I guess he didn't know the route, so he had to wait for our bus driver to arrive. But eventually, our bus driver arrived. When she did arrive, the whole bus started cheering and burst into applause. I even joined in too, as I was ready to get to mom's school. Once I arrived, mom was waiting in her room and we took off afterwards. Finally, before I wrap up algebra for the month, I want to talk about the latest I ever stayed up for a homework assignment. So my church was doing a field trip to volunteer at Operation Christmas Child. We did this on Monday, December 4th. We worked for about 4 hours. It was fun, but we did not get back into church until like 10 o'clock. And I didn't arrive back until 10:15. Therefore, I stayed up till 1 in the morning doing algebra homework. I only got 5.5 hours of sleep. Yeah, that's pretty late for 13-year-old me. So let's move on to PE now. Well, it wasn't PE. Instead, we were now taking health. For health, we had this one dude from the health department talk to us about drugs. I remember that he really liked me, mostly because in the specific group I was in, I was pretty much the smartest person in there, as well as of course the least athletic. We were very similar, as he too was really smart and lacked athletic ability. However, I only appeared for like 2 of the 5 days we had for him. For health. The reason is because I took absolutely forever on tests for English. Like, I remember it taking me around like 1.5 hours to do a test for English. So I spent pretty much my entire PE period working on that test. I most of the time did this on purpose so that I could skip PE, which worked. However, I didn't mind doing health, but I was still in a group with some bullies, so it was just a safety measure. But even so, I still paused health. Now let's move on to world history. So, December 15th was our final day with our intern. She was really nice and great to have, but the teacher we were supposed to have was coming back. And of course, being from the military, I think you can guess how this goes. He was really strict. Our first day with him was on December 18th. This was pretty much just an orientation. He talked about how he did things and what was going to change. For one, Cool Math Games was going to end. So once we got done with our work, we had to go back to our seats and read our AR book. We'll see that on the 20th, there's going to be an issue in regards to that. Fortunately, we were only going to have this teacher for 2.5 weeks, as the class ended on January 12th. But in those 2.5 weeks, we were going to see him act pretty crazily. In fact, the first time we saw him act crazy was literally the next day. So there was a kid who needed to sharpen his pencil. He asked our teacher if he could do so. Our teacher then proceeded to give the entire class a lecture about coming prepared and why you should always come prepared. The funny part about this is that this was all over a sharpening a pencil. His class was literally the time to sharpen your pencil. He ultimately let him sharpen his pencil, but wow, that's kind of excessive. I don't think the entire class needs to know that one kid didn't sharpen his pencil. Then the next day came, also the last day before Christmas break. This involved me. So for the second quarter, I already reached my AR goal. Therefore, I didn't read any more books, mostly just that since I had less stuff to carry. However, I got done with my work early, like I normally did, so I had to go back to my desk. Since I didn't have any books to read, you might think that I just sat there. Well, I didn't. The day before, our teacher gave us a study guide for us to help us study for our final, but I left my study guide in my locker, so I asked him if I could go get it. This man then stops everyone from what they are doing and gives them a lecture about why you shouldn't forget things. Which, I mean, sure, you shouldn't forget things, but how is this lecture supposed to stop us from forgetting stuff? Forgetting stuff is natural. We all forget things. Saying that you shouldn't forget things is like telling us boys not to get horny when we see an attractive woman in a bikini. It won't stop anything. That's just how ridiculous his arguments were. He finished his lecture about 15 minutes after. Afterwards, he then said, "Read something," in a pretty irritated voice. At that point, my mind was just going, you literally just spent the past 15 minutes lecturing the entire class. What else am I supposed to do? I then asked him if I could go to my locker and get the study guide, which he finally allowed me to do. And at this point, I don't know why I normally ask questions, or, well, not at this point, but, and this is why I don't normally ask questions, because shit like this happens. So before I move on to Christmas break, I want to discuss another Spanish project. So this was a Christmas themed project. For it, we were assigned a Spanish speaking country and we had to talk about how they celebrate Christmas. My assigned country was Paraguay. Now, of course, being a Spanish speaking country, you could probably determine that they take Christmas very seriously, since Mexico and Latin America are very Christian places. Spain and Equatorial Guinea not so much, but nobody had those countries. Anyways, Paraguayans celebrate Christmas pretty similarly to how the United States celebrates Christmas, just that they pretty much outdo us in every way possible, especially by lighting. Paraguayans go full on in Christmas lights. Like the average Paraguayan will just fill the entire outside of their house with lights. It's really cool, but wow, that takes a lot of dedication. That's what I remember about Christmas in Paraguay, but that's just enough to impress me. So now we've reached Christmas 2017. Even though this was during the worst time period of my life, this is still probably the best Christmas. Back in October, I broke my 3DS, and so for Christmas, I got a new one, which is what I still use today. I also got my first phone, an iPhone 5, so overall, great Christmas. I'll also take another water break. I also remember throughout this break, I recorded a ton of YouTube videos with my new phone. Like throughout the break, the average video count was probably about 7 videos a day. Yeah, that's a lot. And that takes us into 2018. 2017 was a pretty interesting year. It started out great. The month of May was probably the best month with all that drama and fights to happen that month at school. But then from September onwards, the year just sucked. Depression made me feel pretty bad about myself, and overall, the second half of the year was trash compared to the first half. 2018 was a similar situation in 2017, however, it's best split into quarters. The first quarter would be when I hit my all-time low. However, the second, third, and even fourth were when I was at my all-time high. As a result, 2018 was in my opinion the second best year of my life, only behind 2019. Now, unlike the high school, Christmas break does not separate the two semesters for middle school. Instead, it was separated by Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. Therefore, the final day of the semester was actually January 12th. Therefore, the final for a semester-long course was in January rather than December. This makes no sense in my opinion, as students may forget materials during the break. It also kind of stresses them out during the break too. I'm glad my school does it this way. It's also convenient for me that I could graduate in December rather than January, since college begins in January and all. And when I say school, I mean my current school, not middle school. Middle school does it that other way. But before I get into the second semester, I first want to mention what happens before the 12th. So in English, we begin our new book. This was The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I have little memory of this book, but I still remember it being really interesting due to when it was written. This book was written in the 60s and takes place in the 60s. Many books during this time had professional language and tones. This book, however, used a lot of 60s slangs as well as some other unprofessional language and tones. So this is pretty much a good read, even if I had to open up Urban Dictionary every other minute to understand what it was saying. There was also a project for this that was similar to what we did with The Giver, which I interestingly did not do due to an emergency that happened, but I'll talk about it when we get to March. I also want to mention that our regular English teacher was back. She would be back for the rest of the school year. In Algebra, we of course finished the 6th chapter, so then we moved on to the 7th chapter. This stepped away from linear equations and took us into nonlinear equations. For this chapter, we talked about monomials and polynomials. The first lesson though was pretty complex. We talked about exponent rules. This is a really difficult topic that I still struggle with today. Like I see y to the power of 7 and x to the power of 9, what the hell am I supposed to do with that? I'd at least get it temporarily later on in the year, which I'll talk about later. But the main thing that happened in math was the release of the new law. This law stated that 8th graders taking Algebra 1 were not required to take the 8th grade math EOG alongside the Algebra 1 EOC. This meant that now, all we had to worry about was the Algebra 1 EOC. This made us really happy, as it's one less test we had to take. It also meant that we could go a little slower in the class, which we did, but only slightly. So slightly that you really couldn't tell the difference in pacing from 2017 and 2018. So that was fortunate, but at least we had one less test to worry about, so something good still happened nonetheless. Now for world history, let's talk about one final of those lectures with my teacher. Well, it wasn't a lecture, it was more of a funny thing that happened. So going into world history, I decided to jump up and hit the top of the door. My world history teacher saw this in front of his desk, and he asked, "Did you really need to do that?" I responded with a "No, sir." He then said, "Then why'd you do it? All you did was waste energy. You ain't no Michael Jordan." Afterwards, we didn't talk for the rest of the day. This wasn't really a lecture, but more of a humorous type deal, as he said it kind of in a sarcastic voice. Then that takes me to the world history final exam. We took this exam on Thursday, January 11th. Why not Friday? I don't know. But anyways, I was ready for this test. Our teacher bought the test from the year before and allowed us to take it as many times as we wanted to on the program we used for this class. I also did not have any algebra homework that night, as our algebra teacher wanted us to focus on this test. So I took the practice test as many times as I could until I was confident, so I was ready to go in and do well. The test itself was pretty easy. Not one question stumped me, and I finished within the first hour. I also noticed that some of the questions from the final exam from the practice were actually on this one, so it definitely helped already knowing the answer to those. Ultimately, I made a 94 on this test. I was really happy with this grade. However, world history wasn't exactly done yet. We still had the next day as our last day of world history. Normally, this would have been a fun day. However, our teacher doesn't like fun days, so instead, he made this more of a learning day. What we would do is that we pretend like we were the principal of the school and we wanted to replace the ceiling panels of the classroom we were in. We didn't have to go on our computers and find the cost of one ceiling panel. We didn't have to determine the cost of all ceiling panels needed. We didn't need to figure out a time to replace them and who we were going to get to replace them. Very weird way to end the course, but I mean, at least we only had this dude for only 2.5 weeks, so we didn't have a full semester of this craziness. Now before I move on to the second semester, I first want to mention Spanish one last time. So to celebrate the end of the semester, we held a fiesta. Our teacher had a friend who lives in Washington State who was also from Venezuela. He's a preacher in a Spanish-speaking church, and he and his daughter came to visit us. They were both really nice. The food was awesome too. I forgot what it was, but it was kind of a Venezuelan Christmas special dish. But it was fun, and a fun way to wrap up the class, unlike world history. So then, that pretty much brings us into the second semester. The first was supposed to be Thursday, January 18th. However, it snowed that Wednesday. Because of this, we pretty much had an extended Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. I would also not have gone to school anyways on Thursday, as I got sick. I'd at least recovered that Saturday. And so now we've reached Monday, January 22nd. This is the beginning of the second semester. This semester, as we'll see, was a lot crazier than the first semester. Anyways, I now had 3 new classes as a result of the new semester. The first one was 8th grade science. So this was a replacement of world history. We had to take 8th grade science because at the end of the year, all 8th graders were required to take the science EOG. Therefore, we still needed to take the 8th grade science. The way this class was structured was that there were multiple units. Our teacher gave us a packet that pretty much had everything for that unit. So stuff like the notes, activities, labs, a study guide for each unit test, and a bubble chart on the front page that connects everything. I really liked this as it made the organization really easy. But other than that, this class itself didn't stick out too much. But what really stuck out was the teacher. So she moved here from rural Pennsylvania just 2 years prior to the school year. Therefore, she kinda has an accent that I still sometimes give her a hard time about today. More on that later. Anyways, she was incredible. The reason is because we're gonna see a situation that involves her actually going as far as saving my life. That'll be discussed in March. However, it's honestly hard to describe her initially before what happens throughout the semester. So instead, I'll talk about her throughout the rest of the semester, and you'll understand more about her as I explain. Anyways, that brings us to the second new class, that being art. So art was our replacement for Spanish. I recall that the teacher for this class was really nice. So nice that it was kind of problematic. What I mean was that she was a little bit too nice. The reason I know this is because even though I shared this class with Ryan, I also shared this class with Sir, one of the bullies. This was a problem, as whenever Ryan was not there, Sir pretty much had all the opportunity to harass me as much as possible. Now the third class to mention is pretty interesting. So this was an extra class we could take. It was an online class. This was Earth Environmental Science. It's supposed to be taken in freshman year, but we could take it in 8th grade if we met the requirements. There were 3 requirements for taking the course. The first one was that we had to make a 5 on our 5th grade science EOG. EOGs are graded on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being superior and 1 being shitty. I made a 5 on my 5th grade science EOG, so I was good. The second requirement is that we had to make an A in world history. I did that. And then the final requirement was that we had to maintain A's and B's in all other classes, which I had done, so therefore I was eligible to take this course. I didn't really want to take this course, as I was already under a lot of stress from schoolwork as well as trying to cope with depression. However, I feared that had I not taken this course, then my parents would get really mad at me for not taking this opportunity. So therefore, I ultimately decided to sign up to take it. The teacher for this class was my science Olympiad instructor, so I at least knew my teacher already. Of course I was cool with this, as I loved having her for science Olympiad, so now it was time to take a class with her. Now, in all honesty, the content of this course was not terribly difficult. However, what really set me off multiple times throughout this class were the labs. Because this was an online class, we had to do the labs ourselves. I think this part should have been omitted from the course. I mean, come on, I'm 13 years old. I can't drive, I don't have my own money, it's just really complicated to do them. We also had to send pictures of us doing the lab. This was really hard to do, as even though I could upload YouTube videos and shit, I didn't know how to upload pictures onto a Google Doc. I learned how to do this from that class, but damn, it was painful trying to learn. So now with this new course, you could tell that depression was affecting me more and more. I consider January 2018 to be when depression started to become a very serious issue. It wasn't quite yet extreme, but that will occur in February. But now I was cussing people out even more than I did in 2017, and my grades dropped significantly more. As an example, I'm in an 88 in quarter 1 for Algebra. Here in quarter 3, I'm in an 80. Yeah, that's a huge dip. This would also be when Mom and Dad grew extremely concerned about my grades. They saw my grades in Algebra slip since the beginning of the year, and they wanted to fix it. So therefore, on weekends, which was normally when I was just trying to forget everything that happened at school and relax, they were forcing me to practice algebra and do other schoolwork because they didn't think I was trying enough. Now, before you think my parents are evil or something, I do need to inform you that they did not know that I was depressed. In fact, it wouldn't be until February when they found out. I was just too embarrassed to tell them and thought they would say something like, "Man up," or "You aren't depressed, you're being a pussy." In fact, the only person who knew that I was depressed was myself. So like, they were just making assumptions. They couldn't help it. Wow, this is getting pretty dark. I'm going to change the subject while I'm at it and talk about something legendary that happened on the bus. So sometime in late January, our bus driver quit. The reason she quit was because of something that was at the time extremely serious, but now it's more of a wow, that actually happened type deal. So about 15 minutes after I got off the bus, there was a 7th grader who thought it would be a good idea to shoot a hornet on the bus. A hornet is like a rubber bandish object that stings its target. He thought that he should shoot it at the bus driver, so he did that. Luckily, it missed, but this scared the bus driver immensely. After all, had it hit her, she would be unable to control the bus, putting everyone's life at danger. So she quit. The kid was given a 3-day out-of-school suspension and I believe a 45-day bus suspension. That's 9 weeks. Somehow he didn't get a permanent bus ban, but that's still a long time. The next morning, everyone who rode our bus was required to attend a meeting during WIN. At this meeting, the principal pretty much scolded us and told us that the kind of behavior was extremely dangerous and unacceptable. She also mentioned that our bus driver quit. Therefore, for the rest of the year, we would have a substitute bus driver. Well, till March, but more on that later. Anyways, this substitute bus driver, as you can expect, was really strict on us. For me, this is a good thing. I didn't break any of the rules, and he often got on Ed Sheeran and the other bullies too. In fact, one time he even had me move seats after he mistook me for someone else. This is a good thing. I ended up sitting at this new seat for a week, and then he moved me back and he realized who I was. So at least I was getting better. Now, back to academics. Firstly, let's go back to 8th grade science. So we're on our first unit, being the chemistry unit. For this unit, alongside taking the unit test, we also took quizzes on the periodic table. 8th grade science is notorious because you have to memorize the periodic table. It's not that bad though, all you have to do is memorize each element and their symbol. Although I find it a little bit strange that we had to memorize the periodic table, as on the EOG, we were provided a periodic table, but at least I discovered my favorite element from this class, being francium. If you saw Storytime 37, you know francium is pretty important in regards to discussing chemistry. So then that brings me to a lab we did. We were experimenting with mixtures. Storytime 37ers know exactly where I'm getting at. Anyways, what we did was that we did 3 trials. The first trial involved us mixing baking soda and water. The second trial involved us mixing calcium chloride and water. The third trial involved mixing both baking soda and calcium chloride and water. To mix the stuff, we shook the bags. This will come in really important for the third trial. By the way, we were separated at different tables. I believe there were 5 different groups. For the first trial, the bag became unusually hot. Usually cold, I meant. Yeah, cold. For the second trial, the bag became unusually hot. Then the third trial came, so there was another group who pretty much had the class clown. He was a really cool dude whom I really wished I was friends with. Like, he genuinely was hilarious and sounded like a cool person. He was also very nice from the amount of interaction I had with him. Unfortunately, he moved to Raleigh a couple years ago, so I'll probably never again get the chance to see him again. But anyways, this kid began shaking the bag really hard, but while he was doing it, our teacher warned us saying that we shouldn't shake it too much. Right after she said this, the bag exploded in this dude's hand. A white sticky substance then spewed all over him. Some of it even got on his face. We all laughed. He laughed with us. Afterwards, he got cleaned up. While I know what happened, the bag exploded, I don't remember any specifics about our group's bag. All I remember is that it exploded and that was that. It didn't explode on anyone, it exploded on its own. PE also had a thing happen this month. Well, it wasn't really PE, it was really health. This was the reproductive health part of health. Good old sex ed. Although the term sex seems to have been brought up very infrequently, it was more about HIV and STD and abstinence and protection and shit like that. We never really said the term sex. The girls went to one room while us boys stayed in another room. This was pretty forgettable week. All I remember was that they went on about STDs and how easily they spread. I also remember taking a test, which I made 100 on. But after our test, the teacher did a demonstration to show us how easily STDs spread. However, they did this in probably the weirdest as well as the funniest way they could have. What happened was that there were 5 girls and 5 boys that were taken as volunteers. They each had a cup filled with some liquid that I don't know. Then they poured their liquid into each other's cup. This resembled sex. I think you could tell why this demonstration was weird, as having middle schoolers do this is really suspicious. Anyways, after that, one of the PE teachers dropped a chemical into each demonstrator's cup. If the cup turned a different color, then that signifies an STD. If not, then that means no STD. Every single student's cup changed color except one. Yeah, thank God I was not a demonstrator, otherwise that would have given the boys an extra opportunity to harass me. And so that finally wraps up January. On to February, this was a really difficult month. As stated earlier, this is when depression became extreme. The reason it became extreme was because of the lunch situation. So since August, I've been dealing with the bullies and their minions. They insulted me multiple times and pretty much drilled me into depression. However, this would be the month when they started a new tactic. They knew that not the empty table would not let me sit with them. So they moved over there and sat there. Because these people didn't want to help a depressed kid trying to escape bullying, but they were happy to invite a bunch of assholes who acted like the devil himself over. This, of course, resulted in me now sitting at a table by myself. In front of hundreds of students, I was at a table by myself. Saying that this was embarrassing is an understatement. Every other student in the entire cafeteria had someone to sat with who they trusted. And then there was me, all alone at his own table because everyone hates him. Well, I take that back. There were plenty of people in other classes, most notably my science teacher's second block, who really wanted to help me. However, the school's policy stated that we had to sit with people in our second block. This rule was to make sure that nobody was left out and by themselves. What did it do? Quite literally that, except that it prevented people from helping. Yeah, that is the most poorly constructed rule I have ever heard. So this situation led me from being depressed to being suicidal. I now felt like that if I just killed myself, then nobody would care. In fact, I thought that people would probably celebrate, as that's an empty table anyone could sit at now. As a result, I was more irritable than ever. I was also extremely inconsistent with my mood. I also had very little energy, and of course, I had thoughts of killing myself. I also practiced self-harm almost every other night. I'm not going to state how I harmed myself, but I will say that I harm myself every night. I mostly harm myself to let out my anger, which is not something that I should have done. If I wanted to let out my anger, it probably would have been a better idea to punch a hole in the wall, as while the wall is replaceable, I am not. But this is when my teachers noticed that something was up. They had already noticed a swing of behavior from the beginning of the school year, but now they noticed that my change of behavior was becoming even more exclamatory. They also noticed a couple places where I had harmed myself. So firstly, they contacted the school counselor. They then contacted my parents. They then had a meeting talking about my behavior and what they think is happening. The meeting is pretty much when they determined that I was depressed, which of course they'd be correct. That night, my parents and I had a pretty long discussion about it. This is the first time I ever mentioned what was going on at school, and I did confirm that yes, I was depressed, but I did not reveal that I was suicidal, although they would find out a month later. We talked about the bullies and their minions. I did not give them the names of the bullies, and even almost 4 years later, I still refuse to say their names to my parents. Saying their names would be like saying Voldemort in Harry Potter. They are the names that shall not be named. Anyways, I told them about what they did and how now I was sitting at my own table. They also gave their thoughts about it. Initially, they didn't believe me. They thought I was just making this all up in my head. But then after rethinking the situation, they realized that no, I wasn't making this up. Afterwards, why else would I have a severe mood change from the beginning of the school year to now? They also had another meeting with my teachers and the counselor the next day to talk about possible solutions. Then during art, me and the counselor had a meeting about what they talked about and we discussed the solutions. In the end, we came up with 4 solutions. One solution was to have me sit away from the class. It said I would eat and lunch in this room right next to the offices. I'll call it the cube for now. It had a one-way mirror through it, so while I could see everything going on in the cafeteria, nobody could see me, which was actually kind of cool, but it also made me feel really bad about myself. I was overlooking everyone at their own tables laughing and just being normal kids. And then there was me who was by himself because although he had friends, he wasn't allowed to sit with them because there were a pretty shitty rule. But I mean, at least I wasn't being bullied or at a table by myself in front of everyone. The first day I ate in the cube was on Monday, February 19th. I've always been that kid who brought their own lunch to school, so I didn't have to worry about anybody seeing me trying to get my food. Therefore, I went straight into the cube. This cube was pretty quiet. I generally did not hear anyone at all. The only time I might hear someone would be if the principal or resource officer is on the phone, as both of their offices are connected by the cube. Even though I was alone and not being bullied, well, lunch, PE was a different story. I would honestly say that the cube was ineffective and to some extent, counter-effective. The reason is because it did not solve the root of the issue. The root was that I felt like nobody cared about me and I was a waste of space. The bullies moving to tables that would not allow me to sit with them is a clear example of why I felt this way. I was alone while everyone else was having a good time. In fact, they were probably talking about me and laughing at me too. So now being in a room by myself kind of made me believe even more that I was a useless and a waste of space since I had to be moved elsewhere from the general population. I think a better alternative would have been to switch my classes up entirely. Seems like my counselor agreed after a really serious situation that occurred in March, which I'll get to later. The second solution involved letting Robbie know what was going on. I was quick to let the counselor know who I trusted the most in my second block, so she let Robbie know what was going on. Therefore, when it was time to leave, he would go to the cube and let me know. We would also walk back to the classroom privately. Robbie did not eat lunch with me, as he often had to have silent lunch since he had a habit of not doing his homework back then. He's changed now though, he now makes all A's, but since he had silent lunch a lot, there wasn't a point in him eating lunch with me. The third solution was more of a long-term solution that actually would not take into effect until August. That would be applying to go to early college high school. Now, I had already made up my mind to go here since 6th grade. However, this is when I absolutely wanted to go. At early college, I would receive both a high school diploma and an associate's degree when I graduate as high school. Students that have to apply to go here, and it is a lottery, only about a quarter of students get accepted. If you've seen like literally any other story time, you probably know what happened, but if you haven't, I'll reveal what happens when we get to May. But by going here, I would be away from all the bullies and their minions. That was the main goal of going here. The fourth solution involved getting someone at church involved. This person would be our church's discipleship pastor, so I haven't talked about him much in Storytime, although I really should because he is amazing. Anyways, pretty much what he did was that he agreed to be my friend. We would hang out on Tuesdays after school at his house. Most of the time, we lifted weights. Even though I am not athletic whatsoever, as mentioned at the beginning of the story time, I actually enjoyed this a lot. We also decided to stop going to swim practice on Tuesdays to accompany us, which if you watch Storytime 19, you could probably infer that my coach wasn't too keen on this. But anyways, we also talked quite a lot about what was going on, and he was really a person I could vent to. We would stop lifting weights in March, as a pretty hilarious situation occurred that prevented me from using my arms, although we would still do meetings. In fact, we still occasionally do meetings today, although they're pretty uncommon. Now, one aspect of me being suicidal has still yet to be mentioned. This was from online influences. So, as most of y'all know, I have been doing YouTube for over 5 years. Although I still maintain and even have more dedication to do YouTube now than I did back then, something rare in creators, I used to be extremely busy with YouTube. I would upload somewhere between 5 to 10 videos on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays. Of course, nowadays, I only upload once a week with some other videos in between, but I spent so much time on YouTube. I even reached the 100 subscriber milestone this month. This would be when I began receiving some hate. Now, I'm not going to state who sent this hate, but I will say that they said some pretty extremely nasty stuff in a super despicable manner. In simpler terms, he pretty much just sent death threats to me. I still remember what he said, but I will not recite any of what he said since it is so violent. The reason he sent such gibberish to me was because I was friends with another YouTuber whom he had problems with. They got into some drama in 2014, and even 4 years later, they were still at it. He would constantly attack her and her friends, including myself. This YouTuber would also follow suit with me, as she too became suicidal and went through a pretty much the same situation I did. But YouTube was not the only place I received hate. A more extreme case would be Google+. So this was a social media platform that I was a part of, and oh god, the specific community I was in had drama pretty much every day. Many of my fellow users were friends with the YouTuber who sent death threats to me and the other YouTuber. We pretty much just went all out trying to tell him that he was evil, but they refused to believe us, even with unedited screenshots. They then pretty much attacked us and kinda acted like the YouTuber in a sense. So enduring all this would be when being bullied at school and stress from school pretty much drove me to begin being suicidal. So finally, I could stop talking about this topic. However, it would not go away. It will get even worse in March. But for now, to brighten up the mood, let's talk about academics. So in PE, we did our final health thing. So this was CPR training. We pretty much learned why knowing CPR is important, as well as how to do CPR. This gave us our CPR certification, which means that we are CPR trained. Although if we actually do it, I doubt it. I've kind of forgotten how to do it, so if someone near me has a cardiovascular arrest or something, then they're kind of screwed. Now, I don't remember much of anything about CPR training, except for one pretty funny instance. So in CPR training, we of course work with mannequins. There was this one kid who decided to horseplay. So he picked up the mannequin and threw it at the wall. He then shouted, "F out of here!" Our teacher then came over and without even questioning him, he just says, "Alright, you're done. You failed training. You have to take it later." And the kid was just kicked out of class. Right after this, me and pretty much everyone else just died laughing. After he left, one kid shouted, "What a dumbass!" He's absolutely right. This kid is stupid, but at least he's stupid in a funny way that makes us laugh and not stupid in a bad way. There was also a pretty funny situation that occurred on the bus. I want to think it happened on February 27th, although I'm not too sure. But anyways, there was a girl, a 7th grader, who was good friends with the bully who sat behind me. Ed Sheeran didn't ride the bus that day, so it was just the bully. But she saw that the bully made absurd comments about me, so she joins in and even calls me some names directly. However, she would get a taste of instant karma. What happened was that the bus took an extremely sharp turn. Due to this sharp turn, the bus hit a tree branch, but this dumbass decided to roll her window down before we took off. So when the bus hit the branch went right through her window, poking her right in the head. When the branch left, not only was she left with scratches on her face, but there were also a lot of dirt and even some bugs in her hair. Everyone was all like, "Oh my god, are you okay?" Meanwhile, I was trying so hard not to laugh. I did not laugh out loud, but I wanted to so badly. She never spoke a single word to me ever again. Thank God Mother Nature was on my side. Other words, she would have probably kept up. In Algebra, we begin Chapter 8. This chapter was about quadratics, so factoring is a little bit strange for me. Despite math being my best subject, I still cannot factor quadratics for the life of me. In 8th grade, it never made any sense, and even now, it still does not make any sense. Therefore, if I'm given a quadratic equation, you bet my first instinct is to either graph the equation or use the quadratic formula. Therefore, I did more poorly on this unit than any other unit. I believe I made like a 60 on this test. Mom and Dad were really mad about that 60. Do remember that even though at this point they knew that I was depressed, they did not know that I was suicidal. Therefore, they didn't think about that was on my mind when taking this test. So they pretty much had me work even harder. So things such as practice problems and other stuff, while yes, it did show that they cared, my grades did not increase from it. In fact, I'd argue that this caused my grades to further decrease, as I was under even more stress than I already was before. But my parents didn't know this, that I was suicidal, so they were strict about it. And so that wraps up February, and that takes us to March. March 2018 was by far the worst month I ever lived through. Even though mid and late March were pretty good, in early March, I lived the worst days of my life, including the absolute worst day of my life. Before I talk about this day, I want to give another disclaimer. This is the darkest part of the entire story time. A lot of violence is going to be mentioned. Once again, if you are prone to topics such as suicide and self-harm, I advise you to stop watching this story time and do something else. Anyways, moving on. March 8th, 2018, the worst day of my entire life. No other day comes close to us sucking as this day. This is also the day that defined my 8th grade school year. It also defined the day that I grew up. On this day, I became an adult. So to start, that day itself was unusual. Parent-teacher conferences went on that day, so we got out at 1 o'clock. We didn't sign up for one, so I was going to go to my mom's school at 1 and then go home pretty much straightforward afterwards. This also was our schedule worked differently. So we had no win. Instead, science was my first class, followed by English, which was a full class and not split into two. Then came algebra, then PE, then lunch, and then art. I also had a lot of schoolwork that day. I had algebra homework, environmental science work, 8th grade science work, and my IMP for English. Therefore, I was extremely stressed out with schoolwork. I was also sent a death threat by that one YouTuber that morning. The football also insulted me on the way to first block, so this set the mood. But the reason why this day was the worst day of my life was because this is the day that I went from even farther than being suicidal. I came up with a plan to commit suicide, and even started the attempt that morning. This plan is something I refuse to tell anyone about, but I'll just say that had I been successful, it would have been a very violent way to die. It would start with me harming myself throughout the day, and then ultimately ending all that night. I'm gonna take a water break. If I cry during this, then don't be too surprised. This is pretty difficult for me to talk about. Anyways, let's begin to talk about the day. So the bus to school from mom's school, I harmed myself more. Nobody was around me, as I sat by myself, so I just harmed myself on the spot. Then came 8th grade science. This class was ultimately what made my science teacher one of the greatest teachers I've ever had. In fact, this day in general is what makes each of my teachers the greatest teachers I've ever had. So in science, I harmed myself even more. It seemed like nobody around me noticed or really cared. Then we played a game of quizzes. I almost always came in first place when it comes to games like quizzes or Kahoot, but on this day, I didn't even try. I just sat there and harmed myself. This is when my teacher noticed something was up, so she apprehended me and asked me what was up. I didn't tell her much, but then she noticed some places where I had harmed myself. She didn't ask if I needed to see the counselor. I told her no, but when I said no, I wasn't answering her question. I was answering a different question. That different question was, is there hope? March 8th was a day that I felt like all hope was lost, but miraculously, my teacher seemed to understand what question I just answered, so she then contacted my counselor. I did not immediately told to the counselor. That would not be until PE, but during English, I harmed myself a little bit more. In algebra, I did not harm myself. Then came PE. March 8th was a Thursday, so we did Throwback Thursday and jogged around the gym. During the middle of it, the counselor came over and called me over, so I went with her. She then ordered that I get my stuff and pack up. My stuff was in algebra, so I went over there. My science teacher made my other teachers aware of what was happening, so when my algebra teacher saw me pack up, he gave me a hug and told me that it was going to be okay and I'll get over with. Afterwards, I went to the counselor's office, which was on the bottom floor of the 8th grade building. We talked for a little bit. I also told her my plan. Afterwards, we called Mom and got her over. Mom immediately left her school and drove over here. Her students were left with a different teacher. We met Mom by the front office. However, she was not alone. Someone else came to our school, too. That would be my youth pastor. He often came over and talked to any youth member while they were at lunch. He talked to me all the time. The bullies, thankfully, never questioned it. Although he did not do it when I was in the cube, as he did not know anything about the cube. Anyways, since I was close with him, and still am very close with him today, I asked if he could join us. Being someone he was close to, he wanted to help me as much as he could, so he, along with me, Mom, and the counselor went into a private room to talk. We didn't explain to him what was happening, as he didn't even know that I was depressed. But from what I remember from this discussion was in the middle of talking about my plans to him, I just began crying. In the past 5 years, this was one of the only 2 times I have ever cried. The other one was almost a year ago when a close friend of mine passed away, the same friend whose death inspired me to start Storytime. I remember then Mom just holding me as tight as she could. She too began crying with me. The counselor didn't finish what I was saying. After that, the counselor told us what we needed to happen. She recommended that I go to a mental hospital. Here, they could prescribe medication, allow me to talk with trained professionals, and get me the help I needed. She then hugged me and pretty much said the same thing my algebra teacher said earlier. My youth pastor walked me and Mom to the van. He prayed for us and me and Mom went over there. On the way home, I cried even more. Mom called Dad letting him know what was happening. Initially, Dad was just in disbelief. He thought that this was a joke and I wasn't actually this bad in the situation. Mom then noticed some places I had harmed myself and told him about it. He too thought she might be mistaken. This infuriated Mom, where they got into a heated argument. I remember one sentence Mom said to him, "Come on, stop denying this and be a dad." I didn't cry harder than I had ever had before after she said this. However, I will defend Dad's actions here. Hearing that your son came up with a plan to commit suicide and even began the attempt is like hearing someone died. You go through the stages. That's simply what Dad was going through. He was in disbelief. But then we realized that yeah, it actually happened. He started getting extremely worried and started to feel like me and Mom. Mom then called my aunt. She asked her to pick my sister up from school. She needed to leave early, so she was picked up and taken to her aunt's house. She hung out there until that night. Then when we got home, for the next few hours, me and Mom just hugged. Both of us eventually fell asleep, which explains why we hugged for hours. After we woke up, Mom called Dad again. This time, Dad wanted to talk with me. We talked for a little bit. Dad was still in a lot of disbelief of what happened, but just that now he had somewhat believed us now. I do not remember any of what he said on this call. Then me and Mom headed out for the hospital. I had stopped crying at this point, although Mom was still in tears. But then Mom spoke probably the most imperative words she will ever speak in her entire life. She said, "I do not know why God is allowing this to happen. All I know is that He's going to make something good come out of the situation. Whether it be a few days, weeks, months, or even years, He will do something good out of it." She was right. He would make something good come out of the situation just a month after this. And then we arrived at the hospital around 4:30. We then got settled. We first had to do some drug tests. While doing these, Dad met us at the hospital. At this point, he no longer denied any of what was happening. He was just ready to be with me and take care of me as much as possible. Then came 7 o'clock. The hospital was now going to take me into their custody. Mom and Dad said their final goodbyes and they drove me home. I was left in a sort of waiting room with chairs, sofa, and a TV playing music. I was at a table. In front of me was some food. I did not eat this food. As stated earlier, I did not eat anything that day. Then at 9 o'clock, a doctor called me alongside a security guard, guided me to the top floor and got me settled into the children's mental ward. I was then given a room. Earlier that day, right after me and Mom left, the counselor talked with Robbie. She told him what was going to happen and also gave him some support. This severely negatively affected Robbie and his behavior, but unlike me, who likes to keep his thoughts to himself, Robbie was a little bit more vocal as well as more aggressive about it. We'll see what he does the next day. Now, later on, after admitting me to the hospital, Mom and Dad picked up my sister. She was worried and scared about what happened. Mom and Dad let her know. When she heard this, she started crying herself. I am not surprised in the slightest about her reaction. She was 11 years old in the 5th grade at the time, so knowing that her older brother went through a situation like this had a big impact on her. She would actually end up crying herself to sleep every single night while I was in the hospital. Now, oftentimes, I try to think what would happen had I actually gone on and committed suicide. My main theory is that it would have had a domino effect. I felt like had I committed suicide, my sister would follow, as I don't think she could ever live without me. I didn't think Mom and Dad would have killed themselves as well, knowing that both of their children were dead. Outside of them three, I don't think anyone else would have committed suicide, but they would enter an extremely deep depression. I think the person who would have been the most affected would be Robbie. We had known each other since 6th grade. What was he going to do now? And then Ryan, what would happen to him? My teachers, God, they were going to have to probably thought of themselves as failures because they couldn't stop a student from killing himself. But the more I think about this question, the more I am thankful that I am still alive today and that I did not kill myself. That night, my parents emailed my Earth Environmental teacher about what happened and requested her to extend the due dates. She complied and pretty much gave me infinite time to complete my work when I was discharged. She also took me out of the Science Olympiad competitions since she knew that I was not going to be able to attend. Now, for the next 5 days, I was in a mental hospital. Even though it is technically not about school, I will still talk about it since it's extremely vital when discussing the situation. So to start, the wing had 2 hallways perpendicular to each other. One was a boys' hallway and the other was a girls' hallway. The hallways met at a pretty large room that included a large window, some sofas, a table, a drink dispenser, and a refrigerator. This is called the group room, as this is where we did groups. The boys' hallway also had the doctor's office and the recreational room. Most of my time was spent in the recreational room. Now, who was I with in the hospital? Well, I was in the hospital with 6 girls. It seemed like I was the youngest, as well as the only patient who is 13 years old. The girls seemed to be from ages 14 to 17. Throughout our time, we all became extremely good friends. I do not know where the girls are today, but I do wish they are doing well. Anyways, I was woken up at 7 o'clock. Time for breakfast. Breakfast was okay. Eggs, bacon, that stuff. It wasn't the best, but definitely better than lunch or dinner. Then came group time. We pretty much gathered around while a nurse taught us a lesson. The nurse talked about suicide and why it wasn't the answer. He did it pretty interestingly though. He actually managed to prove scientifically why it wasn't the best, which I thought was really cool. But I didn't get to see the whole thing, as afterwards, the doctor called each person to her office. She called me first, since I was the new patient. We talked about what happened the day prior. I also told her about the plan and what I wanted to go about coming to the plan. Then came snack time. I don't remember what I ate, nor do I remember any other day what I ate for snacks. Then lunch. Lunch and dinner were both the worst parts of the day. The reason is because the menu was simple, chicken tenders and fries. Now, while you might not think this is a bad thing, it was awful. In fact, I refer to this food as dog shit with my parents. Since then, I've kept a name for it. The reason it's so bad is because all we ate for lunch and dinner every day. Therefore, I ended up losing my appetite. This ended up keeping me there a day later than I was originally supposed to be discharged. Afterwards came rec. So for this, we had this Russian dude pretty much walk us around the wing and do stretches with us. It was really relaxed and nothing too crazy. Then came music. This is held in what I refer to as the recreational room. Basically, this dude brought his laptop and we each got to play any song we wanted to, just that it had to be appropriate. I don't remember what songs I chose, but I believe I picked a Fall Out Boy song that day. Then it was pretty much free time for a few hours. Me and the girls spent our time in the recreational room. We watched multiple movies and played card games together. Then came dinner, pretty much the same thing as lunch. Same dog shit, nothing special. After dinner came visitations. Our parents could come during this time and visit us. Mom and Dad visited me every single night. Only parents were allowed, so my sister could not visit. So that day, they took my phone and looked through it, as they were suspicious of what was happening with me online. This is when they found the death threats, as well as all the drama that went on. I remember Mom saying that if she saw that YouTuber sent me death threats, she would smack the shit out of him. I absolutely agree. I'd smack the shit out of him too. But what's memorable about this visitation session in particular was that during the middle of it, a nurse came over. She said that I was the smartest person to ever go through the mental hospital and claimed that I was way too smart to be there. Which, she was right. I'm a pretty smart person. I have a 128 IQ, 1280 SAT score, and a 4.6 GPA. I'm pretty smart, so therefore I shouldn't have allowed myself to develop these thoughts. After visitations, we played more in the recreational room. We also received any items our parents brought us. My parents brought me some clothes and my Bible. Then it was bedtime, so every single night I was at the hospital, I had a nightmare about either the lunch situation or the events of March 8th. Therefore, I generally got very little sleep while up there. However, as I'll discuss later, these nightmares were not exclusive to the hospital, as I still have them even today. Now, that day of school had some stuff happen, so let's start off with Robbie. Now, of course, Robbie's mind was going haywire. Knowing what happened to me, he couldn't think straight. So I think what happened was that one of the bullies, who also had a distaste for him, insulted him. This tipped Robbie off the edge so much that he picked up the chair and attempted to throw it at him. The bully managed to take it from him and set it back down. Robbie got suspended for a day. However, this suspension wasn't really a punishment. Robbie should have just not gone to school that day. He really needed the day to relax after what happened on March 8th. So I think giving him a day to relax was good for him. Now, how did I know this? Well, my teachers and counselors stayed into close contact with my parents. That way, they could make sure that they were okay and that my parents could report back to them after each visitation session to update them on me. They told my parents what happened with Robbie. Then the next day being Saturday, March 10th. So this is a good day. Even though I was still depressed, I actually would stop being suicidal. I pretty much decided that no, suicide was not the answer and said I was not even going to think about it. However, I was still depressed, but that was coming to an end really soon. Anyways, the next day was pretty normal. However, the meeting with my doctor was interesting. She decided to prescribe me Zoloft. Zoloft is a drug that slows down the nervous system, therefore slowing suicidal thoughts. However, getting used to Zoloft is pretty difficult to do. Getting used to any medicine in general is difficult to do, because on Sunday morning, I even felt really bad. Saturday night was the first time I took it, so I was now feeling the side effects. I ended up vomiting that morning. As a result, I pretty much just spent most of the day in my room. In regards to the meeting with the doctor, she came to me for it. To help with it, she prescribed another drug, which I forgot what it was called. All I know is that this drug pretty much helped deal with the side effects of other drugs, such as Zoloft, so I took it. Although that was the only night I took that drug, as I got used to the Zoloft rather quickly. Then came Monday. This was a very eventful day. It would also be the day I started a new chapter of my life, which is also the greatest chapter of my life. So that morning during snacks, we were allowed to call our parents. I called Mom. She was doing pretty well. I too was doing very well. We didn't really talk about depression or anything like that. We just talked about how she and everyone else was back home was doing. But that night is what changed pretty much the entire course of where I was going. So for visitations, Mom and Dad were late. Therefore, instead of talking about depression, we just simply cracked jokes and made fun of stuff. This meant that more than anything else in the world to me, because I was having a normal conversation with someone who cared about so much about me. 2 people actually. When I was depressed, all I wanted was for someone to care about me and to love me. I had not felt this feeling of love in months, and for the first time, I genuinely felt like I was loved. This was the moment when I was cured of depression, and all of it took was a simple conversation with my parents. After visitations, the nurses opened up another recreational room that had a Wii and other stuff. However, I just wanted to go back to bed early. They allowed me. I wanted to go back to bed early because I really wanted time to think to myself. I mean, come on, I just got over the most challenging obstacle of my entire life. You bet I needed some alone time to think all this through. And then brings us to Tuesday, March 13th, 2018. This was the exact opposite of March 8th, as it was one of the best days of my life. Now, this one was one of those days where I woke up and I knew this was going to be a good day. I predicted that I would be discharged that day. Fortunately, this was a self-fulfilling prophecy, as that's what happened. So, at the meeting with my doctor that morning, she pretty much said that I seemed really happy. She also noticed me laughing and just having a good time with my parents the night before, so she decided that I would be discharged. We did this over the phone with Mom. She didn't ask when Mom would be available to pick me up. Of course, Mom's a school teacher, so she didn't get off work until 3 o'clock, but she said that she'll just be on her way to pick me up now. So she left her kids with a different teacher, but this time for a good reason, and headed to the hospital. She didn't pick me up and we headed on out. Wow, after 5 days of being in the middle hospital, I was now free. Not only from the hospital, but also from depression. No longer was the chains of depression holding me back. I was now free to be happy and enjoy life. And holy shit was I in enjoy life. This was the day that post-depression period part 1 began. It was a time period of long-term happiness that just overall so many amazing days. It lasted from March 13th all the way to November. I would then follow suit with post-depression period part 2, which lasted from March 2019 to March 2020. So the first thing me and Mom did after getting discharged was to go out to eat. We ate at a nearby Cracker Barrel. Here I ate probably the best meal I had ever eaten in my entire life. I ate a vegetable plate. I had broccoli, lima beans, pinto beans, and mac and cheese. What an incredible meal to have after not eating anything healthy in about a week. And also, Cracker Barrel has the best vegetables ever, so that made it all the better. Then we headed over to my sister's school, that of course being the intermediate school. We went over to pick her up early, so we went to the front office and asked to pick her up. She then came over to the office, where I was standing. She immediately began running towards me. Both of us then hugged for about 30 seconds. It felt incredible getting to see her again, and of course she was super excited to see me not just back, but also not depressed anymore. Afterwards, we went home. So when we got home, I just went straight to my room. I noticed that on my bed were some letters and cards. One came from my sister, another came from my grandmother, who also made some of her world-famous chocolate chip cookies. By the way, if you think someone can make better chocolate chip cookies than my grandmother, then you're wrong. You're wrong. She makes the best cookies. I also had letters from cards and from other family members too. Afterwards, me, Mom, and my sister pretty much just played Uno until Dad got home. Dad was aware that I had been discharged earlier that day. Normally, he likes working an hour later to make sure everything is done, as well as to avoid the treacherous rush hour traffic we have here in Charlotte. However, on this day, he left at 5 o'clock. He then got home at 5:45, and wow, he was happy, which is pretty much expected. Everyone was happy that day. Afterwards, we ate dinner. I forgot what we had for dinner that night, but it really doesn't matter. After dinner, me and Mom just hung out around around my room. We watched The Big Bang Theory the rest of the night. Although I was quick to fall asleep. I fell asleep at around 9 o'clock, which is very rare for me since I'm a night person. But I mean, I was so happy that I just fell asleep. I also remember having an extremely great night's sleep. I did not have a nightmare that night, which was greatly appreciated since I had one every night at the hospital. So yeah, this whole situation is the reason why 8th grade was the most important school year of my life. At the beginning of the school year, I was a child. After this situation, even though I was still only 13 years old, I was an adult. Much of my wisdom and knowledge I have today was gained from the situation. So now, after a situation like this, there are going to need to be some changes so that this doesn't happen again. In my case, there were plenty of changes that occurred, but there are 10 in particular that stand out. The one that probably stands out the most is the change in schedule. So on Friday, my parents, teachers, counselor, and principal had a meeting to talk about the best course of action to take once I was discharged. The counselor noted that the cube solution was ineffective, but they did not want to just allow me to sit anywhere I wanted to at lunch, as if I did, then other students might complain and cause a huge controversy. So instead, they decided to just switch up my classes. So now I had English first block and then science second block. Therefore, science was now the weird class that was split in between two. I would also be sitting with them for lunch. This was the ideal solution, as remember, second block science was that class that was extremely concerned about me. The reason they were concerned is that many of my friends were in this class, including Ryan and Sebrin. Many people from the church were also in this class too, so they told the others about why I mattered and stuff like that, and they got on board too. When we talk about going back to school on March 14th, I talk about how I was treated in this class. The second change involved my science teacher. So every day before class, she would do pretty much a daily checkup, as I'll refer to it as. She just asked me how I was doing, just making sure I was alright, as we don't want any more March 8th bullshit to happen again. This was pretty minor in comparison to other changes, but it's still important to mention because it showed that everyone was looking out for me and that people cared about me. The third change was medicine. So, as stated earlier, I was prescribed Zoloft while in the hospital. I had now gotten used to it, so I didn't have to take the other medicine that I was prescribed. But anyways, I took Zoloft every night. The reason I took it at night was because the side effect of the Zoloft is that it makes you drowsy. Therefore, it helped me sleep better. Although we'll see in a little bit that might not have been a bad thing. But the Zoloft at least slowed down my nervous system, which kept me from being depressed. I took this medicine for 2.5 years. It wasn't until I was 16 years old in 11th grade when I finally stopped taking it. The fourth change was therapy sessions. So after this situation, I began having mental therapy sessions bi-weekly. How it works is I pretty much talk to a therapist about what's going on and how I'm doing. Contrary to the medicine, I still do mental therapy sessions today. My therapist is awesome. However, over time, these appointments have gotten less frequent. At the end of freshman year, so maybe around sometime in May 2019, we switched to being monthly. This frequency went from the end of freshman year all the way to March 2020. In March 2020, coronavirus hit, so we started having these appointments less frequently. Since then, these appointments have been reduced to about for a year. But even today, these appointments are extremely beneficial and very effective. A fourth change would be in regards to my phone. So my parents took away my phone and of course looked through it while I was in the hospital. This is when they found all the death threats and other vile stuff. So they took away my phone. Originally, they were going to take my phone away for a pretty long time, but they would ultimately give my phone back in early April after my therapist recommended that they do it when a pretty funny situation occurred in late March. A fifth change kind of correlates to taking my phone, but in a way it is a little different. That would be leaving Google Plus entirely and taking a long break from YouTube. I made one final announcement on Google Plus on March 13th, and after that, I left. Google Plus was then shut down in August 2019, which I'm glad it did. Even though I still made some good memories on it, the large majority of memories are bad and just evil in general, so I'm glad it was shut down. I would also take a long break from YouTube. Now, glaringly, I did not leave YouTube entirely, as I'm still releasing content today. However, I took a 4-month break. I came back in July of that year, although I would disable comments and only upload once a week. A sixth change was in regards to workload. So my teachers pretty much decided that they needed to lower the course workload, as this was of course a factor of depression. However, I was a lot less stressed from the schoolwork from this point onwards. However, I still had some makeup work that I needed to get done, which I'll get to later. A seventh change was transportation to and from school. So my parents did not know that I was being bullied on the bus until the situation arose. So we decided that from now on, Mom was going to take me take me and pick me up from school directly from school. Therefore, I was no longer being bullied on the bus on the way to mom's school, and no foul insults were being shouted at me while getting off the bus. It would also be a way for mom to know if anything crazy was happening at school, although if she was unavailable, then I would have to ride the bus, which never happened thankfully. An eighth change was family dinners. So we pretty rarely ate as a family before the situation. It simply was because it was too late to eat as a family, and therefore I just simply heated leftovers and started doing schoolwork. However, we decided that for now, pretty much every night except Fridays, we would have family dinners. This has been going on since then, although they aren't as frequent because I work 3 nights a week, but despite that fact that I don't talk as much at these, they're still great to have. A ninth change was actually a negative change. That would be the nightmares. So as mentioned, I had a nightmare every single night I was in the hospital. These dreams were typically about the lunch situation or the events of March 8th, although they sometimes are about topics even worse, from violent things happening to the bullies to even me doing unspeakable stuff that I would never even think about doing. However, these nightmares were not exclusive to the hospital. I had a nightmare pretty much every other night throughout 2018. Therefore, I often delayed my sleep. Fortunately, these nightmares became less frequent starting in 2019. However, I still have them today. Even though they are a lot rarer nowadays, only appearing in maybe once every month, they still haunt me in my sleep. I tried to stop having them by just trying to forget the situation, but me forgetting what happened on March 8th would be impossible. I have to live with what happened on March 8th. Therefore, since I have to live with this, I decided to be more vocal about it to others to make sure that they learn from it. So really, even though it is a negative change, I am turning it into a positive one. Then, the 10th change will not be mentioned until May, and actually would not begin until August, so therefore, we could skip over this one. And so that takes us to my first day back at school. From this point onwards, school was going to be a lot of fun. So the first class of the day was wind. So now that Science Olympiad was pretty much finished, I instead was going to my algebra teacher's room to supposedly work on algebra homework. However, here's the thing, I always did my homework the night before, therefore I really didn't have anything to do. But guess who was also in this win? That would be Robbie. So when Robbie saw me, he was excited, therefore we along with some of our other friends just talked the whole time. Then came my new first block, being English. Now, while I was in the hospital, the class was assigned another literary essay about the outsiders. I believe the question we had to answer was Dali a hero or a bad guy? Like the giver, I won't detail anything about this essay since I won't be mentioning any spoilers. I also do not have anything to talk about for this essay, as I never did it. The reason is because it was assigned while I was in the hospital. My teacher just exempted me from this essay. The only reason I remembered the essay is because I edited a friend's essay. Then came second block science. Second block being science. So before class began, my teacher pulled me into the hallway. She pretty much said that she was excited that I was back and relieved that I didn't actually go out and kill myself. She didn't talk about this class in particular. So these are some crazy people, but as I'd find out, they were crazy in a good way. They were also much smarter than the people I was with in first block. Therefore, I was no longer the king of quizzes. Afterwards, we begin class. Now, speaking of kings, I was pretty much treated like a king in this class. This was, after all, the class that was really worried about me. So now that I had a class with them, they were hyped. They were also, of course, relieved that I didn't commit suicide. However, they wanted to make sure a situation like this never happens. So pretty much everyone talked to me and pretty much made me feel like I was one of the elites. Even today, I am very grateful for their generosity and the care they gave me. Now, each table in science had a spot for someone to sit at. Everyone wanted me at their table. Even the elites wanted me at their table. While I would have loved to have sat with everyone, I sat with Ryan. We've been friends since 7th grade, and both of us have grown very loyal to one another. Then came PE. So remember how I said that I generally don't remember any of the electives except one? Well, this is the elective I remember. Now, elective decisions were made at Friday, March 9th. I was not there to make a decision. Therefore, every elective except one was already filled up. The one that wasn't filled up was basketball. This meant that this might not seem too bad at first. After all, I live in North Carolina, so I obviously watch college basketball since we're pretty big on that over here. I also was slightly taller than the average 8th grader, as I grew a couple inches throughout 8th grade thanks to puberty. However, when it comes to playing basketball, I can't do shit. On top of that, the bullies chose basketball back on Friday, so this was problematic. However, right before I started, the counselor came in and called me over, and behold, she saved me again. We went over to her office. We simply talked about how I was doing and now that I was out of the hospital. We also talked with each of my teachers to ask what work I needed to make up. So for the next 2 weeks, I would work on makeup work during PE. This makeup work was pretty much everything I had to do on March 8th, as well as work assigned while I was away. Thank God I was no longer in PE for now. Then came lunch. This is when the lunch situation took a complete 180. So, like in class, my entire second block wanted me to sit with them. I went from being left out and not wanting to be sat with to people literally begging me to come eat lunch with them. Like how it went with this class, I sat with Ryan and his friends. Although occasionally I would go over and talk to other tables too, most of the time to crack a few jokes. It should be obvious, but I was no longer eating lunch in the cube, by the way. And then came the second part of second block. From here on out, the schedule was quite normal. As mentioned, algebra got a lot easier. Not only was the workload less, but I also could fully concentrate on algebra. My teacher also sat me far away as possible from the bullies to make sure they didn't do anything suspicious. He also sat me next to Ryan, as Ryan is a freaking genius. Therefore, I also had a friend who helped me in algebra when I needed it. Then that means now I was only with 3 bullies in 3 classes. I was with them in PE, which I was not participating in, algebra, which was already settled by my teacher, although the bullies never even had an opportunity to bully me in algebra to begin with, and art, whom I shared with Sir, although he could not bully me around Ryan. I also shared classes with multiple friends, including PE. Now let's move on to academics. So in English, we really didn't do much outside of course, the Outsiders essay. In fact, I don't think we even read a book after the Outsiders, so there really won't be much anything mentioned in regards to the class until May. However, we still had the INP due on March 9th, but since I was in the hospital that day, my teacher pretty much gave me as much time as I needed to get it done. For it, I just read the latest Diary of a Wimpy Kid book and did something I did with the first INP. It was pretty easy and forgettable, mostly just because things like March 8th greatly overshadowed stuff like this during this time period. In 8th grade science, we did our molecular biology unit, same deal as the chemistry unit, just without having to memorize the periodic table anymore. It was a pretty straightforward unit. It was also easier to grasp, since I wasn't depressed anymore. Nothing too notable arose from it. Nobody got blown up or anything. In algebra, we finished chapter 9. This chapter wrapped up quadratics and also went into exponential functions. Therefore, we begin chapter 10. This was on radical equations. Now, I remember very little in regards to radicals. All I remember is how to simplify square roots and that the x value is not all real numbers. However, there was also something that happened in regards to my algebra teacher. So a little bit after I was discharged, he started having heart problems. As a result, his doctor only allowed him to work half days. Therefore, every other day, he would work before lunch, and then leave, and then arrive after lunch and work for the rest of the day. So therefore, our workload was reduced even more, as we now had a secondary teacher every other day. She was already an 8th grade math teacher at her school, so I'll call her the secondary teacher. Anyways, she was pretty nice. She was pretty quiet whenever she wasn't teaching, which is definitely not like our algebra teacher, who cracked jokes and even pulled pranks on students on occasion. So then that brings me to Wednesday, March 28th. So this is a pretty hilarious situation that I mentioned earlier. Although it not take place at school, it did have a huge impact on school. If you saw Storytime 36, which more than likely you have since that seems to be the most popular Storytime I've done, you already know what happened. So I'll give a brief description of how it happened and what it took to fix it, but I'll go into more detail about how it affected school. So this happened at swim practice. Although this wasn't a practice, it was a party to celebrate the end of the season. This party was set outside the pool building. However, about 100 meters from the pool building was a tennis court, so me and some friends decided to go over there and hang out. That was when I had the greatest idea any human ever conceived. What if instead of going around the tennis net, I go over it? So that's what I did. I got in running position and then sprinted to the net. I managed to get great height. However, my foot got caught in the net and I began falling face forward. To protect my head, I immediately sprawled out my arms. The left arm fell to the concrete ground first. The right arm followed a few milliseconds afterwards. My arms were now in pain. Initially, I thought it was just a scratch my arms and then it was no big deal. However, I noticed that it was a big deal when I realized that I could not move my left arm at all and my right arm had limited mobility. I should go ahead and specify this was not a suicide attempt. It was just me being a dumbass. I then called Dad, who immediately came over. He then took me to the emergency room. My emergency room experience was pretty awful. We got there at 5 o'clock, but we didn't get checked in until 8. So much so for an emergency room. Finally, they got me at 8 o'clock. But the worst part was that the doctor and nurses were even worse than the wait. They were extremely unprofessional and they were at times very stubborn. But eventually, I got my x-rays done. This would be at 9 o'clock. From the x-rays, they determined that I had completely shattered my left arm and had minor infractions on my right arm. This meant that yes, I broke both of my arms. They had to wrap me up in 2 splints, which from the pictures Mom took, looked pretty hilarious. Afterwards, or not afterwards, however, the material they used to wrap up my splint was really cheap and just really bad in general. It was really hard. While you expect that to be a good thing, it wasn't. It ended up causing boils and blisters on my hand. I would have these splints on for 5 days. The next Monday, I would see a pediatrician. So you might guess that because of my broken arm, I got a lot of days off of school. Well, that's where you're wrong. I only missed 1 day of school because of this. I missed that Thursday, March 29th. The reason I missed only 1 day of school was because that Friday was Good Friday, and then the following week was Easter break. The emergency room then prescribed me with hydrocodone. This is a drug that treats pain, so I was now taking 2 medications. We did not leave the emergency room until 11 o'clock that night. We then got home at 11:15. This was a really difficult night because I did not have either of my arms. Although I managed to teach myself how to do normal stuff such as using the bathroom and even typing by myself, I still needed some help for other stuff such as eating and carrying things. Mom didn't email my teachers that night about what happened. Keep that in mind, as one of them will spill the beans to the students. I'll let you guess which one. So then that brings us to the next day. The only day that I missed school from my broken arms. I woke up at around 3:30 that afternoon. So I attempted to get both of my splints on. However, I only succeeded in getting my left one on. Therefore, I just ignored my right arm. However, this is when I noticed that my right arm had quite a lot of mobility. So much so that not only could I do stuff like pick up video game controllers and stuff, but I could also type with it. So that's what I did. I literally wrote a paper with 2 broken arms, and I still could type pretty fast. I could type up to 100 words a minute, which is my normal words per minute. With 2 broken arms, I could type 45 words a minute, so I still kept a lot of speed and a lot of consistency. Now let's move on to that night. So at 6 o'clock, I had visitors. Those visitors were both my discipleship pastor and my youth pastor. Mom told them what happened the night before, so they paid us a visit. I don't remember much from the visit, but I was at least glad they came. Now, that night after they left was really special. So as mentioned, I taught myself how to do things with 2 broken arms. This time, I taught myself how to operate YouTube on my TV. I taught myself how to do this and stayed up to 2:30 in the morning watching YouTube. The next day, March 30th, was busier, so me and Mom ran some errands that morning. Firstly, we went to Walmart. Normally, I'm in charge of pushing the buggy, but Mom did it herself. But the memorable part came at checkout. So the lady was of course doing her normal thing, but then she saw me. She then said, "Oh my god, what just happened to you?" I honestly didn't want to say anything, mostly because I was kind of intimidated. Mom then spoke up and said that she broke my arms because I wouldn't clean my room. For some reason, this lady believed her and just became so frightened. Mom then told her it wasn't the real reason and explained what actually happened. The lady then breathed a huge sigh of relief. The next stop was a mental therapy appointment. This is my second one. Just like the lady at Walmart, my therapist was surprised too. We didn't just joked about it. We also talked about what was going to happen in regards to the meeting with the pediatrician the next Monday. At the end, Mom came over. My therapist then gave her a recommendation that put an end to one of the changes. She recommended that she give me my phone back. The reason is because it was not healthy for me to be in my room by myself without access to the outside world, especially with my broken arms. Even though my uncle and his 2 kids from Delaware were coming over later on that day and staying for the whole weekend, I still needed contact with my friends from school. Mom and Dad would follow up with this recommendation a week later. Then, as you could probably expect, my uncle and his 2 kids came over that night. They were actually kind of concerned about coming over, especially in regards to me, but they still came over anyway to help me out with stuff. The next day had pretty much nothing going for it. So finally, let's talk about April. April 2018, alongside August 2018, was probably the best month during the post-depression period part 1, as well as the best month in 2018. Pretty much nothing went wrong this month. So to start, let's talk about April 1st, which was Easter Sunday. So to celebrate Easter, we glaringly went to church. However, what was memorable about the service wasn't the service itself, it was youth right afterwards. So I was of course walking to youth. But then 2 boys from second block came over out of nowhere. One of them said, "Wow, our science teacher was right." And then the 2 started laughing. I laughed with them. So if you guessed it, it was my science teacher who spilled the beans over my broken arm. And you'd be right if you guessed her. The class asked her where I was that day, since they were concerned that I might have done something. She didn't explain what happened. The class was worried about me, but not in a serious way like they were on March 8th. After all, had I heard that one of them broke both of their arms from being stupid, I probably would have laughed too. That pretty much happened all that day at church, that day. So that takes me to the next day, April 2nd. This was the meeting with the pediatrician. So his office was in South Park. South Park is in, as you could guess, Southside Charlotte. Although it's not too far down south, it's just a couple miles south of Uptown. This is pretty much the Dubai of Charlotte. It's super wealthy and very flashy. So for the meeting itself, the pediatrician cut my splints off and did more x-rays. He determined that my right arm could be free. So therefore, I was no longer wearing a splint on my right arm. I also now had more freedom on my right arm than before. However, there also came some bad news. My left arm would need surgery, but fortunately, the surgery would be done just 2 days later on Wednesday, April 4th. Afterwards, the pediatrician wrapped my arm in a new splint. This splint was a lot softer, but still hard enough to protect me. He also gave me a comfortable sling, as sling provided that the emergency room was really uncomfortable. After the appointment, we went to the South Park Mall. This mall, like the rest of South Park, is super antique and really nice. So the reason I bring this up is because when we were at the mall, we got food. We ate Chick-fil-A. This was when I realized the amount of freedom I had on both of my arms now. So I ordered the normal number 1 large. My right hand was able to hold the tea. Meanwhile, I was able to keep my bag on my left arm. They did not hurt at all, so for the rest of the time my arm was in a sling, I was able to do this. So let's go to Wednesday, April 4th. So this was the day I had surgery. The place I had surgery was different from where the doctor's office was. This was at a surgical center in Uptown Charlotte. We arrived a little bit early, so we just drove around Uptown. When it hit time, we went to the surgical center. The pediatrician was outside waiting for us. He then guided us through. About an hour after processing, it was time to begin surgery. The pediatrician told me that once he inserted the medicine that makes you go to sleep, to count backwards from 10. So when he did it, I did. I can't remember exactly, but I don't think I even reached 8 before I fell asleep. He and his team then got to work. So while I was taking a nap, the pediatrician and his team pretty much cut open my arm. They did screws and wrapped some wires in my arm. Then after a couple hours, which really felt like no time at all since I was unconscious, I woke up. Now, being high and all, I said some pretty funny shit, but I noticed that both of my parents and the surgical team were by my bed. They then helped me into mom's van, and then we took off. Now that that's all over with, let's go ahead and move on Monday, April 9th. I did an entire story time about breaking my arms, which was Storytime 36. As mentioned, it's my most popular story time on both views and likes, so I definitely recommend checking it out. Anyways, let's start off with English. So everyone knew what happened and where I was, so seeing me in a splint didn't surprise anyone, but I still got considerable attention. Ryan and Sebron were both dedicated book holders. We all shared classes together, so they carried my stuff for me. Even though I could carry Chick-fil-A, I couldn't carry stuff like binders or books, so I needed help with that. Therefore, they came in and helped. Then came science. So before class began, my science teacher talked to me in the hallway like she did on March 14th. For this, we just talked about my arm and what all happened the week prior. Then came the class itself. So already, second block was a fun class, but this day in particular was extremely fun. It seemed like every other thing someone said involved my arm. The amount of jokes made about my arm wasn't even discernible. Of course I found these jokes funny like everyone else since I'm not a pussy. Then midway through science, we went to PE and lunch. Of course I did not do PE due to my arm, and which is pretty glaring why. In fact, I actually did not do PE for the rest of the school year. This was a big win for me, as that was one class I marked off with the bullies, as well as with the asshole teachers as well. So in a way, jumping the tennis net was actually kind of a smart move, as that decreased contact with the people who drove me to March 8th. Instead of going to PE, I just hung out in my algebra teacher's room. All of my belongings were kept in science since I still had like 40 minutes left of that class. Therefore, I didn't need help getting something in algebra, although if I did, then my science teacher would generally help me out. All I did in algebra was do random stuff on a Chromebook. However, I used this as an opportunity to get back at the bullies by making their lives a little bit more difficult. What I did was that I would go to my English teacher's room to get a Chromebook. Everyone had their Chromebooks open, as almost everything we did in that class was on a Chromebook. Since I knew where the bullies sat, I would take the Chromebook and use it throughout the period. I would of course log out of their stuff and log into mine. When it was time to go to lunch, I would log out of my profile by just shutting the Chromebook off. I would then put it back in their spot. Therefore, after lunch, they had to log back in and get their assignments pulled back up. To make myself look less suspicious, as well as to just mess with them, I would also take Robbie's Chromebook on occasion. None of them ever found out, except Robbie, although it took him 3.5 years to find out, as he would find out when he watched Storytime 36. And then came lunch. My teachers and I went to lunch together. I didn't join my table and ate lunch. But then came cleaning the tables. Our table does something differently when it comes to cleaning. While I was sitting with the bullies, I was pretty much forced to clean the table every day. However, our table led by Sebrin had it so that everyone took turns cleaning their eighth of the table. I really liked this concept, as it demonstrated that all of us were equal and that we all made up a piece of the table. Although I could still could clean the table with my arm, Sebrin stepped in and cleaned my part for the table for me. We sat beside each other, by the way, so I didn't have to clean my part of the table for the time being. After wrapping up the second part of science, we went to Algebra. Now, my teacher offered to make a copy of the notes for me, but I declined and chose to write them myself. After all, I am right-handed, and it was the left arm that I was in a sling, so I continued to write them myself. At the end of the class, my algebra teacher or the secondary teacher, whichever one was teaching that day, would help me with my books. Ryan and Sebrin would get to class, so the teachers just helped me out. Then came art, so we were just working on whatever. However, I wanted to try to make something with a broken arm, so I decided to make a paper-mache Dorito. This took me 2 weeks to make, but in the end, I was successful. I managed to make an equilateral triangle measuring 2 feet on each length. I did have to have a little help from my teacher, as well as from Ryan, since I was kinda disabled, but I still did the large majority of work, but it still came out a success. I still have it today. I use it as a reminder to always strive for your goals, even in the toughest of circumstances. Of course, one challenge of making this Dorito was because of my disability, but another problem that arose was Sir, so this situation is why I gave him the name. So one day, Ryan was not there, and because our teacher was just a super passive teacher, Sir could get away with anything whenever Ryan is gone. Therefore, he took advantage of this. So while I was working hard on the Dorito, he dropped the cardboard box and exclaimed that this is what I'm going to live in 10 years. He then proceeded to craft a samurai sword from that cardboard box. He didn't hit my arm while I was working on the Dorito. This hurt a lot. He also tried to choke me at one point. Nobody seemed to do anything. But then finally my art teacher took action. Although she didn't do much, she just pulled him off to me. He didn't receive any punishment from this, which I honestly think he should have. I don't remember exactly what provoked this event in particular, but I think it might have started with him saying something that and then I retaliated or something. I'm not too sure, but I gave him the name Sir because of clearly trying to be a knight in shining armor, when in reality he was nothing more than a 14-year-old psychopath. By the way, this didn't happen on the first day back. It happened sometime the week after in the later stages of working on the Dorito. Then the next day, our science teacher announced that the school was hosting a dodgeball tournament. Each team competed in the tournament. Of course, she announced this to us in second block. Every single boy except one, as well as 3/4 of the girls, which was like 6 girls, signed up. The only boy who did not sign up was me. Very glaring why. However, this kind of sparked another meme across the class. This meme was simply me not signing up for dodgeball. Anyways, let's jump to April 13th, which was the day the dodgeball tournament was held. Alongside the dodgeball tournament, this was also a very eventful day, as well as one of the best days of my life. So, I know y'all really want to know about the dodgeball tournament, so let's talk about it first. Now, to y'all's disappointment, I do not remember exactly how the tournament went. However, I do remember where I was. I was in the stands of about 30 girls. There were 10 girls who were specifically around me, since girls seem to like guys who jump over tennis nets and break both of their arms. So if you want a girlfriend, then here's my advice. Nah, I'm just kidding, don't be a dumbass. In fact, the last time I've even had a girlfriend was in 7th grade. I'm now a senior, so I guess I'm forever alone. Anyways, me and the girls were of course cheering on our boys and girls on the field, but we did it in kind of an exotic way. Let's just say that we shouted pretty much every cuss word you can think of. In previous story times, I've always made it out like I was the only one, but I recently contacted a girl who was with us, and she confirmed that she was shouting cuss words alongside the other girls and myself. We also dropped the F-bomb on everyone on our team, which was pretty much, it was just like, F you too, you over there, F you. We of course screamed this, which I can't do an impression of right now since it's 12 in the morning, but we either didn't get called by the teachers or the teachers heard us but didn't care. The second choice is probably what happened. After that craziness, it was time to go home. Well, I wasn't going home. In fact, I wasn't going home until Sunday, April 15th. Firstly, I had a mental therapy session after school. This, alongside pretty much every other mental therapy session was pretty forgettable, so we could move on. After that session, Mom took me to McDonald's and bought me some food. She then took me to church. Now, why the hell was I going to church on a Friday? The reason is because I participated in a church event called DNOW 2018. This is a youth event that lasted the weekend where we stayed at someone's house. While at their house, we participated in group sessions with 13 churches in the area. I'm not going to discuss really anything about it except one thing that happened the night of April 14th, as I did an entire storytime on this event, being Storytime 12. It's really old, as it's really just 2 weeks younger than the original 8th grade Storytime, but it's still really good that actually has good quality for a Storytime that old, so I definitely recommend it. Now, that night of April 14th was legendary, but firstly, I want to go back to what March 8th, more specifically when Mom said, "I don't know why God is allowing this to happen, all I know is that He is going to make something good come out of this situation, whether it be in a few days, weeks, months, or even years. He will make something good out of it." This is the day where that prophecy became truth. So we were in a session with the speaker who was talking. I have no idea what he said, but all I know is that there was a force inside me that said, "It's time to make a decision to follow God." And so I answered it. At that moment, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. In just 1 month, I went from wanting to kill myself to making the greatest decision one can ever make in their entire life. Now, giving your life to Christ is like getting accepted at an Ivy League school. You tell everyone you see or interact with about it. But for me, that didn't happen. I only told my group leader, my youth pastor, and I texted my parents. There's nothing wrong with that, as exactly 1 month after this, I was going to do a public confession in the form of baptism. More on that when we get to May. So yeah, this happened. This situation right here is why I'm glad I went through depression and all that struggle throughout 8th grade. God used this to struggle to get me saved. It really fascinates me that He can do this, but I mean, that's what makes Him so special. He takes our worst moments and turns them into good ones, all for His glory. Alright, let's get back to school. So let's talk about the final fight I have to discuss for this school year. So unlike the other 2 fights, this was a girl fight. I personally think girl fights are worse than boy fights, as girls often pull each other's hair. I've also heard some girls have even gone so far as to take their shirt off and make the excuse that a teacher can't touch her because that would be sexual abuse. So girl fights are bad. Now, I didn't actually see the fight. However, when I was already in algebra right when everyone was on their way to PE, everyone just started running down the hallways. But for me and my algebra teacher's mind was going, what the hell is happening? I predicted that it was a fight, so I stayed in his room so that I might not get caught up in it and get damaged. My teacher on the other hand went down and checked it out. He arrived back shortly. He didn't explain what the fight was and how it was. It doesn't seem like any hair pulling or throwing shirts off were prevalent in this fight, although the girls did throw punches and throw each other into lockers. Both of them had some bruises as well. Now, on to April 18th. There was a field trip that our team did. This field trip was a baseball game. I'm a pretty big baseball fan, so why didn't I go? Well, I was kind of worried that a baseball would fly right into my arm, which isn't a bad excuse. After all, if that did happen, there would be serious issues. It also was going to be astronomically hot that day, and even though I love hot weather, I didn't want hot weather while in a splint because that would burn up my arm. The bullies also went, and even though my friends were going too, I just didn't want to take any chances if I was going to be put in a vulnerable spot. So I just stayed at school and did quote-unquote makeup work, which I mean by makeup work though is playing cool math games as I had everything done. However, right before this game is when another member of the boys got injured. That member was Robbie. I actually saw him get injured too. Robbie also loves it when I bring this up in story time, so I might as well talk about it again. What happened is that he tried to do a Fortnite dance in class. However, I think he hit his desk and then just fell to the floor in agonizing pain. He couldn't get back up. 911 was then called and he was taken out on a stretcher. He ended up dislocating his knee. Therefore, for a few weeks, he too would sit out for PE. However, his injury was nowhere near as serious as mine was, so he only got out of PE for 3 weeks. By the way, we had different PE periods, so we didn't hang out in our algebra teacher's room together. The next day was also a big day. The reason is because I had a follow-up meeting with the pediatrician, well, his assistant. He was away. Anyways, the assistant looked at my arm and determined that I needed to recover as much strength as possible. Therefore, I no longer wore a splint on my left arm. However, I would now be doing physical therapy on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Physical therapy would last all the way until the end of May, as I would have a follow-up appointment on May 31st. The first day of physical therapy was the next day at 2 o'clock. Therefore, I now had to get out of school early on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays to attend physical therapy. Now, in my personal opinion, physical therapy was a lot easier than I thought it would be. Most of the time it was just a therapist applying pressure to my arm while I was playing Clash Royale. Yeah, that's how I did physical therapy. Extremely easy to do. However, a familiar face also did physical therapy. That would be Robbie. He had to get physical therapy on his foot. I believe his was on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, so we actually had our appointments at the same time on Wednesdays. I thought this was pretty cool, and he agreed with me. He said that this was cool as well when I asked when I asked him about it. So, now let's jump back a little bit and talk about academics. Then I'll move on to May. So in 8th grade science, we did 2 units. One was on diseases, while the other was on water. But in the midst of the water unit, there was a huge debate that went pretty much across the grade. Is water wet? I was on the side that said that water is not wet. In fact, I went so far as to doing research during PE. I managed to find a study that pretty much said that no, water is not wet. It just has the property to make things wet. By pulling up the study, I managed to settle down the dispute, and yes, the yes side conceded. Our science teacher was actually on the yes side too, so I even proved her wrong, which is probably the only time I've ever proved a teacher wrong, not including my sociology professor. Also in 8th grade science, we did a project. This project was a presentation on any disease of our choice. We did this with a partner, therefore I worked with Ryan on this. We just do our presentation on the bubonic plague. We talked about its symptoms as well as of course the pandemic of the mid-14th century. Ryan pretty much made all of the slides and added information as well as the bibliography, while I decorated the presentation and made it look good. Sometime in late April, we presented these. Both of us had a pretty extensive knowledge of disease prior to this project, since we learned about it back in world history, so we took turns on each slide. It was successful, and the class liked the presentation. When I say the class, I mean the teacher too, as she gave both of us 100. In Algebra, we wrapped up Chapter 10. We then did a few more lessons. Afterwards, we were supposed to move on to 8th grade math topics not mentioned throughout the school year. However, because that new law was passed back in January, we now had a whole month to review before taking our end of course test. Review was really easy. Of course, not only was I familiar with these topics we discussed, but I was also not depressed. Therefore, I easily understood everything talked about in review. As a result, I would make an A this quarter rather than a B, like I had been doing all year long. Then in Earth Environmental Science, I found a revolutionary technique that made my life a billion times easier on the labs. So I asked my instructor if I could just find someone doing the labs on YouTube instead of doing them myself. That's because of my arm, and she said I could. This made this class so much easier. I no longer had to do the labs. Wow, I was relieved. I also began making higher grades on labs too, so me, my instructor, and my grade were happy. What's ironic is that mom advised me not to do this, so to hear that this was a pretty big slap in the face for her, but even she was happy that she didn't have to go to Walmart and buy something stupid like cornstarch or anything. And then that brings us to May, the final full month of the school year. May 2018 was an interesting month. The first part of the month was amazing, but I remember the middle of the month being kind of a low point in the post-depression period part 1. But in late May was really good, but also busy since there was a lot of testing going on with it. So to start, let's talk about a big school field trip I went to. For this trip, we went to Wilmington, a large coastal city just about an hour and a half north of Myrtle Beach. We stayed here from May 2nd to May 5th. We had been planning to go on this trip since the beginning of the school year. Like, our first payment for the trip was on the first Friday of school, so that was like September 1st. The second was in November, and the third was in February. After all, this is a pretty expensive trip, so we had to pay in sections. There's also a limited number of spots on the trip. We paid as early as possible for the first week of school, therefore, I had a spot reserved on the trip. Those who paid later were placed on a waiting list, so if someone lost their spot, either by them changing their mind or due to behavioral issues, the person at the top of the waiting list got their spot. Now, there were some initial problems about going on this trip. For one, none of the other members of the boys were going. Ryan didn't want to go, and Robbie kinda had some behavioral issues, so I was the only one who went. Another thing too is that the football, alongside a few minions, did go as well. Therefore, there could be a chance for them to bully me. Sir did not attend, as he had behavioral issues. However, I was fortunate enough to have a friend go on this trip, that being Sebron. Therefore, I pretty much hung out with him most of this trip. Now, that also brings me to how rooming worked. So on Friday, April 27th, everyone who was going to Wilmington gathered in the library. Then we got to choose who we wanted to room with. It had to be 4 people in each room. Sebron already had 2 others with them, and so when he saw me looking for me, he immediately called my name and I asked if I'd room with them. I gave him a hell yeah, and our room was settled. So our room consisted of me and Sebron, but let's talk about the other 2. One of them is someone that you might recognize if you saw Storytime 30 or 33. This is Anonymous. So Anonymous was an extremely smart dude. He was also that kind of a hothead. If you remember in Storytime 32, he raged at getting a 31 on his pre-ACT. I haven't talked to him since sophomore year, as he moved to Durham in mid-2020, but from what I remember about him, he was pretty arrogant about being on the internet and all, so that's why I'll refer to him as Anonymous in Storytime. The other dude was someone whom I haven't mentioned in Storytime. His name was Dale. Dale is really funny. Pretty much if anyone was down, he'd try as hard as he could to make them laugh. Dale was awesome. Me and Dale talked quite a bit throughout the school year prior, and he was also good friends with both Seaburn and Anonymous, so he of course joined us. So let's jump to the morning of May 2nd. So normally, I rode the bus to school. I should go ahead and clarify that while I no longer rode the bus back from school, I still rode it to school since I was just with the others whose parents were teachers. They were nice, so I still stayed with them. But this morning, Dad drove me to school. He drove me to school in order to help me unload my suitcase since even though my arm was not in a splint, I still had very limited control over it. He also turned in my medication since I couldn't do that myself. But what I remember most about this was the teacher who was over the stuff. She pretty much just guided me and Dad into a room and for us to place down my suitcase. They then started talking, and it got to Dad bringing up me breaking my arms back in March. But I remember her response pretty well. She said, "Don't worry, he's gonna be fine. He's gonna have a lot of fun even with that arm." She was right, I did have a lot of fun, even though I did have to sit out on a few stuff. Anyways, that day at school was really a half day. We pretty much burned through all our classes that morning, and then we ate lunch. After lunch, we were all assigned a bus, and then we were all placed in a room with our teacher and our assigned bus. My assigned teacher just happened to be the teacher who taught with Dad that morning. This is the last thing I remember about her though, as I don't really remember seeing her the rest of the trip. So onto the bus. Now we did not take an ordinary school bus. Instead, we used 3 coach buses. These buses had portable chargers, air conditioning, heat, comfortable seats, and movie players. So we were set. We took off at around 1 o'clock. Now, none of my roommates were on this bus. Thankfully, the football and his minions were not on the bus either. Luckily, 2 friends from 7th grade were on this bus, and they both invited me to sit with them. These 2 friends were named Todd and Michael. Both of them were really cool, and I had not talked to them since 7th grade, so it was really neat getting to reunite with them in such a way like this. However, one funny way of reuniting on the bus was through pranks. We 3 played a lot of pranks on each other on the ride up there. One example was a prank me and Michael played on Todd. So he fell asleep. However, he left his phone on while playing music. So I got a hold of his phone. I didn't unplug his earplugs. Afterwards, I got gave the phone to Michael. Michael then pulled up a gay remix of Rockstar. He then gave the phone back to me. I then blasted it at full volume. I set the phone back on Todd while the music started blasting. Not only did it wake him up, but the whole bus heard it too. Everyone, including the teacher, bus driver, and even Todd himself, started laughing. By the way, Todd didn't wake up startled. He just woke up calmly and heard a song from his phone and started laughing. This happened on the first half of the drive to Wilmington. Halfway through, we stopped at Chick-fil-A. Only that I did not sit with Todd or Michael. I instead sat with some friends from church. I had the usual, and they all had their own usual as well. Afterwards, we hit the road again. Now this is when Todd decided to get revenge. So Michael and I were talking to some girls beside us. Therefore, since none of us were watching Todd, he found the perfect opportunity to prank us. He pulled up Rap God on his phone. He then jumped to the really fast part of the song. He then turned his phone to full volume. So while we were distracted, he put his phone right to my ears and started playing it. Me and Michael both yelped. The whole bus started laughing at us. And after that scare, Michael and I started laughing with everyone. But I gotta admit, Todd got both of us really good. So shout out to Todd. Finally, at around 5:30, we arrived at our hotel. Our room was pretty ordinary. 2 beds, TV, window, desk, and a bathroom. We didn't spend much time here though, as at around 6:30, we did our first activity. That activity was skating. We went to a nearby skating rink that we could skate or we could play arcade games. I did not skate due to my arm. Fortunately, my parents brought with me $30 specifically to play arcade games since they knew that this would happen. So that's what I did. Some people didn't skate, so I wasn't alone. So I played some arcade games. One game I played in particular was this game where you stack blocks as high as possible. Not sure what it's called. If you reach the maximum height, you get a pretty crazy reward. Y'all probably know what I'm talking about, so I'm not going to try too hard to explain. But anyways, I got really consistent at it the more I played. But then, I hit the opportunity of a lifetime. There were 2 rewards you could get. There was a minor reward that was 3/4 of the way there, but there was also a major reward that was the full way up there. I skipped over the minor reward and went big. A bunch of people noticed too. Right when I selected to go big, a bunch of boys started huddling around me. I think somewhere around 45 boys were around me. Then I was at the final block, the block that determined if I would win a major prize or win nothing. The boys then did a drum roll. I then placed the block at just the right spot, and then all the boys, including myself, just went insane. We managed to gather even more people, including some teachers and some girls. For a second, I thought I was about to be picked up and thrown. That of course did not happen, although it would have happened had it not been for my arm. Anyways, I selected my prize and got it. I then held it up for everyone to see. I won $50. For this game, I made a $25 profit. Everyone just started going ballistic again. I spent $30 the next day, so this came in really great. So then around 9:30, we left the skating rink and headed back to our hotel. Me and all the other roommates stayed up to around 2:30. We stayed up late because Sebron brought his PS4, so we streamed GTA 5 until 2:30. Every single room, including every girl's room, had the stream pulled up on their TV, so everyone was watching us. The football never commented on anything, by the way, so I was good. I remember on one occasion we betted Anonymous to do something. He lost, so for his punishment is that he had to eat a warhead on camera. Warheads are really hot candies, so he ate it and he started going crazy. This was so funny. We then gave him some water. Once he calmed down, Anonymous started laughing. The viewers were also really amused as well. Then at 2:30 we went to sleep. This is when we chose who slept in what bed. It wasn't too bad figuring out though. Dale and Anonymous slept in one bed while me and Sebron slept in the other. And that takes us to the next day, May 3rd. So we had to wake up at 7:30, which kind of sucked since we stayed up to like 2:30 that night before, but it was better than getting up at 6:30 like usual school days. The hotel provided breakfast as well, so we had time to wake up at least. Then at 9 o'clock, we got the show on the road. Firstly, we went over to Fort Fisher. This military base was used by the Confederacy back in the Civil War as a strategic commerce and export hub, so we toured around it. I don't really remember too much from it other than getting kind of hot from the heat. Not sure where hot tub came from. I remember that we were there. Then we went to the Wilmington Museum. For this, the teachers just let us go aquarium. Not sure why I put museum. I probably should have edited this part of the story time. For this, the teachers let us go wherever we wanted to, just that we had to stick with our roommates. Overall, this was pretty forgettable, although I do remember Dale taking my picture inside of the teeth of a megalodon. This was cool. The best part is I still have that picture today, which is the only reason I remember it. Then we ate lunch at the aquarium. Once we were done with lunch, we still could go to the gift shop and buy anything if we had money. I had $75 on hand thanks to me winning $50 the night before. So I bought a $30 stuffed shark. It was pretty large for a stuffed animal, but even for 13-year-old me, it was still cool and it was fluffy, so I wanted it. After the aquarium, we did more of an academic activity. This was also the messiest part of the trip, as we could get a lot of sand on ourselves. This event involved us going to a pretty large-sized promontories that some scientists were doing research on. To do this, we took a motorboat over there. Somehow they fit all of us onto the motorboat. Not sure how, but anyways, there's a scientist who pretty much stood over us while talking about the wildlife that lives on a promontory. I didn't pay attention, as I was more worried about my glasses that were gonna fall off my face and some facts about seagulls. Then we reached the promontory. We then did some hiking around the landmass. We hiked through sand dunes and even some trees. Then we reached the middle of the island. Here we just looked for some aquatic animals for the scientists. I was the only person who did not participate in this since I didn't want to get mud on my arm, but I do remember joking around with my friends and telling them to search harder. Then we went back to the mainland. So that promontory was really nasty. I got a lot of mud and sand in my shoes. That was also the only pair of shoes I brought with me. But then I had a 300 IQ moment when we were back at the hotel before the evening events. What if I clean up my shoes in the bathtub? So that's what I did. I applied warm water on my shoes and cleaned them off. My roommates came over and checked out what I was doing after a little bit, and they realized that this was pretty smart. So after I finished washing my shoes, they each took turns washing theirs. We sat our shoes by the bathtub to dry. And then we ate dinner. Dinner was at Golden Corral. Nothing too memorable about it. After Golden Corral, we went bowling. Bowling was pretty fun, as I actually got to participate in it. Once again, I'm right-handed, so my arm didn't affect my ability. Other than that, bowling was pretty forgettable. That night back at the hospital, Sebron streamed again. He streamed more GTA 5. However, we only stayed up to around 12 o'clock, as all four of us were pretty worn out from that day before. That brings me to May 4th, the final full day of the Wilmington trip. So that morning, we got to tour the USS North Carolina. This was a large battleship used during World War II. It worked pretty similarly to the aquarium, where we went over wherever we wanted to, just that we had to be with a group. So me, Seaburn, Dale, and Anonymous toured the ship together. We pretty much explored everything we could. We went to the top of the ship where all the machine guns were, to the bottom of the ship where the living corridors were, as well as some other stuff. This thing was huge, but yet it's still impressive how people still lived on this boat back during the war. Once we were done, we got to go to the gift shop. I bought myself a mini USS North Carolina in a bottle. I love this, and so did my roommates. Too bad I don't know where it's at anymore. So earlier, I said that Wilmington is a coastal city. Wouldn't you expect us to go to the beach while we were there? Well, that's what we did as our next thing. We had 2 hours of beach time. However, for our bus, it was only 1 hour because we had to go to Walmart and get something. Yeah, that sucked. But nonetheless, I still had a fun time on the beach. So one thing Dad packed with me was a football. He knew that I was not going to be able to do much during the beach time, as not only could I not get in the sand, but I also couldn't get in the water. So this football pretty much served as something to do on the beach, and oh my god, did this football work miracles. So, I pretty much just got out my football. Immediately, a bunch of boys, most of whom had gathered around me when I won the $50 2 nights earlier, asking if they could use my football. The reason is because our teachers brought balls with them, just that they were really old and ineffective. I swear to God, I will never be able to talk about this in a way that cannot be taken out of context. It's never gonna happen. Anyways, I let the boys use my football. I also joined them and played football with them. Now, you might be thinking that this was unsafe. After all, I might be tackled onto the ground and my left arm be in agonizing pain. Don't worry, we took precautions. We played tag football and all the boys went soft on me to make sure nothing happened to my arm. Overall, this is really fun and a good game of football. After the beach, we went back to our hotel room to prepare for the night. Like the previous night, we went to Golden Corral again. Pretty forgettable dinner like the day before. But then came a ferry ride across the ocean. This was a party, and oh boy was this night legendary. There was a lot of funny shit that happened at this party. So early into the party, some students noticed that there were some poles out inside the ferry. So being 8th graders, they correlated that to a strip club. So there were some students, both boys and girls, who started pole dancing. They didn't take off their clothes or anything, they simply just danced off the pole. To make things funnier, some students even started throwing cash at them. Me and pretty much everyone else started dying laughing. The teachers didn't intervene and told everyone to stop, probably because they were making the captain horny or something. Then some people started dancing like usual. I didn't dance since I suck at it, but many people did. But then, probably the biggest event from this party occurred. This was a flip-off. 2 boys, both of whom were notorious for being able to do flips, competed each other to see who could do the best flip. How it worked was that everyone huddled around them. Each boy took turns doing a flip. The winner was determined by whose flip the audience was the loudest on. However, I think it was a tie. We all cheered extremely loud for them to the point that the music, which was already blasting at full volume, was not even audible due to how loud we were. So both boys won. This is probably the hypest part of the entire trip, and for good reason. That night, me and my roommates immediately went to bed, as we were all tuckered out from the party. Then on Saturday, May 5th, we headed back home. Overall, really fun trip and a great way to celebrate the end of the year. However, May 5th wasn't just unique because it was the last day I got back from Wilmington. It would also be the day where when the ninth change occurred. So Mom picked me up, well, the 10th change. Yeah, I need to edit that. So this would be, so Mom picked me up, of course. I talked a little bit about how it went until she handed me a letter. I opened up that letter, and a billion emotions just went through my mind reading it. I had just gotten accepted into early college. No longer was I going to school with the bullies. I was also now going to be in a challenging learning environment with others like me who wanted to learn. I was thrilled. I was up for the challenge and excited to go here for high school. And I've got to say, going to early college was easily the second best decision I've ever made in my entire life. The best one was, of course, giving my life to Christ. I'm now a senior here at early college, and I'm going to be graduating with both my high school diploma and associates in science next month. It's crazy to think that I've come so far from then to now. Like, the stuff I write about feels like it happened yesterday, even though it happened so long ago. But here we are. So let's jump to academics. Pretty much all of our academics were influenced by the end-of-year tests that were coming up later that month. Therefore, pretty much everything we did was review. The only thing we did that wasn't review was at the beginning of the month in 8th grade science, where we did our final unit on archaeology. This was the easiest, as well as the most interesting unit for the course in my opinion. However, that's not to say we worked all month. In English, we kind of started our end-of-year activities a little bit early. We started these in late May, and the test wasn't until June 1st. I don't remember the end-of-year activities too well, but I believe we just chose activities to do from a spreadsheet our teacher listed out. I remember me and Ryan worked together on some of these, just that I don't remember what we did. All I remember is that we did them. That brings me to May 13th. So this was a Sunday, so as you might be wondering why I mentioned this, well, it was a very special day. Not just because it was Mother's Day, but also the day that I got baptized. Exactly 1 month after giving my life to Christ, I publicly confessed it through baptism. This was a supernatural experience that made me go, wow, I can't believe it, after it occurred. It also reminds me of March 8th again, but in a good way. Crazy how God uses a situation like these to create situations like these. I love how he does things. Now I want to jump to May 22nd. The reason I want to jump to this date is because this was pretty much a ceremony for all accepted incoming freshmen for early college. Here we got to meet our fellow future classmates by doing this team building exercise where we try to make a shelter for all of us to fit in. I was in a group with me, Anonymous, and 3 girls. One of those girls dropped out after sophomore year, and of course Anonymous moved to Durham. That leaves me and 2 girls remaining. The 3 of us today are really close friends. Pretty crazy how that's how we met. It still felt like yesterday we did this exercise, even though it feels strange to think that I once was not comfortable with them like I am today. So wow, things have changed a lot. So now let's move on to something that those who watch Storytime 32 are very familiar with, that being end-of-year test. So 8th grade, I took 3 different types of end-of-year tests. The first end-of-year test was the only end-of-year test I took in May was the Algebra 1 end-of-course test, or EOC. There are 4 high school courses that have EOCs, instead of final exams. World History was a final exam course, by the way. The EOC courses are Algebra 1, Algebra 2, World Lit, and Biology. However, I managed to be born at just the right time to have a pretty unusual circumstance in regards to EOCs. So I took the Algebra 1 EOC in middle school, so that's 1 down. I then took the Algebra 2 EOC in freshman year. However, that test did not count towards our grade because it was the first time that the state gave the test. I then never took the World Lit or Biology EOC because it was 2020 when I was supposed to take them, and they got canceled due to coronavirus. Therefore, I could pretty much say that I went through high school without taking a legitimate EOC, as the only legitimate EOC I took was in middle school. That EOC of course being the Algebra 1 EOC, so this was a 75 question test. We were given 3 hours to take it, but we were offered more time if we needed it. This test counted 20% of our grade, and we had to make it at least a 70 in order to pass the course, so this was a big deal. However, I was ready. As mentioned earlier, algebra was coming extremely easy for me now that since I no longer was depressed and could put forth my full focus and attention to it. The only thing I still couldn't do throughout this course was factor quadratics, which really wasn't needed since no question asked to factor anything. They wanted me to solve it, so I just used the quadratic formula to solve these problems. Then I heard probably the most satisfying words I think I've ever heard. You have completed the North Carolina Algebra 1 end-of-course test. These words were not spoken by my algebra teacher, as they were actually spoken by my science teacher, as we took this test in her room. Finally wrapping up this course that I struggled with all year long was by far one of the most satisfying feelings I have ever had in my entire life. So, how did I do? Well, for over 3 years, I forgot. However, when I was writing Storytime 2032, I calculated my grade by using previous grades from each quarter and my final grade for the course. Since I knew each of those numbers in each quarter also counted 20% of my grade, I determined that I made a 96 on this test. Yeah, after struggling with algebra all year long, I managed to make a 96 on it. This was even more satisfying. And so that brings me to June, the final month of the school year. This would also be the month that I took the last three end of year tests. The first one I took was on Friday, June 1st. This was the reading end of grade test, or EOG. Now, EOGs are different from EOCs, as we take both reading and math EOGs from 3rd grade to 8th grade. Science works a little differently, which I'll get to later, but to get the gist of it, EOCs are pretty much the same as EOCs, just as they aren't applied to your final grade. Instead, they're really testing the teacher. They want to know if the teacher taught everything and taught it effectively. If the school scores high enough average or shows good enough improvement, they get extra funding. That's why even though these tests aren't applied to our grade, our teachers still stress us out over it, as it determines if they get paid. Now, as mentioned, these tests are graded on a scale, on a composite score between 1 to 5, 5 being excellent and 1 being shitty. Not sure why they don't do a regular percentage like they do for EOCs, but that's for all years for you. Anyways, my overall experience taking the reading EOG was pretty forgettable. All I remember is that I made a 3 as my score, which isn't too bad, that's average. In 6th and 7th grade, I made a 4, but I mean, I wasn't going through everything like I was in 8th grade, so it makes perfect sense why my grade fell. Then on Monday, June 4th, this was the day I took the Earth Environmental Science final exam. This worked similarly to how World History final exam worked back in January. 40 questions, and it was worth 20% of our grade. After all, this is a high school course. Our 8th grade science teacher actually monitored this test, not our Earth Environmental Science teacher, as she had to monitor the Social Studies final exam for her 8th graders, as all of the 8th graders were doing that day. Our team wasn't, since we took World History the first semester, so we didn't have to worry about that. Anyways, I remember this test being really hard. A lot of the questions written pretty strangely. It also almost felt like the person who wrote this test spoke English as a second language. It was weird, but to my surprise, I actually did really well on it. I made a 90 on it. No idea how that happened, but it happened. The Earth Environmental Science was another course that I struggled with, so making an A on it also was really satisfying. Not as satisfying as Algebra, but still very satisfying. And then the next day, we took the final end of year test. This was the 8th grade Science EOG. Now, Science EOGs are pretty weird compared to reading and math. The Science EOG is only given to 5th and 8th graders. 3rd and 4th grade doesn't have an end of year science test, and then 6th and 7th graders take a final exam similarly to how I took World History and Earth Environmental test. So pretty strangely how it worked. Now, like the other EOGs, this was scored on a scale of 1 to 5. It also had 75 questions, so this was a long ass test. However, it was pretty easy. I ultimately made a 5 on it, but even better, I scored higher than 96% of all students who took it in the entire state. While this was good, it was actually worse than what I did in 5th grade, when I scored 97% higher, but nonetheless, I was still really happy and glad to have that over with. Now before I move on to the last day of school, I want to go back a little bit to May 31st. This is when I had a follow-up appointment with the pediatrician. Both he and his assistant were there. They determined that the physical therapy I went through in May was extremely helpful and that my arm regained much of its strength back. However, I did not regain all of my strength back, as that break after falling off the tennis net was so severe that even today, I still do not have all of my strength. Like, my left arm still cannot lift a lot of stuff by itself, and it still cannot stretch entirely like my right arm can. By the way, my right arm regained all of its strength back, so I didn't have to worry about it. They then said that I would be able to do physical activity in 3 weeks. Conveniently, 3 weeks after the appointment was my 14th birthday, being June 21st, 2018. The last day of school was June 8th, so therefore, I didn't have to do PE, so I pretty much won big time from this appointment. So now let's go back to June. More specifically, I want to talk about the last day of school, being June 8th. The last day of the hardest school year ever. You bet that this day was going to be pretty emotional, especially with all that happened throughout the year, and it did. I'll get there. So that morning, Mom drove me to school. However, she didn't go through the car rider line. Instead, she parked at the back of the school and we walked in together. She didn't walk into the gym, as the school was holding an award ceremony shortly. I diverged from her and went to the English. Everyone was already there. When I walked in, the class clapped for me. They knew what happened in March 8th, so there's no reason to explain. Anyways, I mostly talked with Ryan and Robbie. We were allowed to go to any teacher's room we liked, so Robbie came over and talked with me and Ryan. This was when I told him about something that I had kept a secret from anyone at school for almost 2 years now, my YouTube channel. I had never told anyone about my YouTube channel prior to this because I was quite embarrassed about what I uploaded. Nowadays I don't mind since I'm proud of what I upload. But anyways, I told them about it and that they were both subscribed. It was very wise for me to do this, as because I did that, we three are still staying in contact today despite the fact that I go to a different school than they do. Then our English teacher came around and handed everyone a letter. She wrote a letter specific to each student in all 3 of her classes. I don't not have my letter with me anymore, but I do remember it mentioning how much I grew from how much I learned how to turn a bad situation into a good one. She was of course referencing the transformation of me coming up with a plan to commit suicide to give my life to Christ. She actually goes to my church, and she did see my baptism. So she congratulated me on getting accepted at early college, and wished me good luck for all my future accomplishments. Before we get to the award ceremony, let's talk about one of the funniest things I have ever seen in my entire life. So if you remember from the very beginning of the story time, the first day of Algebra was an all about me assignment. You may remember the boy who did it, but not on time. Well, today, the last day of school, This kid does it and turns it into our algebra teacher. He invited me and the boys over to the algebra room, and we saw him turn it into our algebra teacher. Our teacher made by far the most hilarious face I had ever seen. We laughed so much from this. Our teachers then joined us and laughed too. Of course, this was not put in his grades, since grades were long past due, but it was so funny. And then comes award ceremony. So I did not expect to win anything, just like in 7th grade. If you saw Storytime 15, you might remember that even though I didn't expect anything, I got four awards. Well, 8th grade was kind of similar. I won 2 awards, but only one of those was a physical award mentioned at the award ceremony. The other was an emotional award. I'll get to that later. But first, let's talk about the physical award. Now, this is probably the best physical award I've ever received. The reason is because this award was a big slap in the face to my world history teacher. This one came back in December. So during that whole don't forget things lecture, he said, "You will not be successful in this class." This is when his words pretty much became invalid. Because I won the award for making the highest grade in world history, this surprised both of us. Even though he signed the award, I was surprised that I even won the award, and he was surprised that the highest grade in this class came from the depressed kid out of 90 other students. So getting this award was really awesome. Now, the award ceremony, after the award ceremony, Mom and I talked to my teachers as well as the counselor. We pretty much just thanked them for everything they did back in March, as well as wished them well for the following years. Now, it's interesting to think about these teachers and how they helped me back in March. The reason I find it interesting is because all 4 of us were struggling with something. This was a difficult school year for my teachers as well. So of course I was struggling with suicidal thoughts and depression. My English teacher was struggling with her adopted baby who unfortunately passed away in November. My algebra teacher was struggling with his heart problems, and then my science teacher was struggling with integrating into a southern lifestyle, as well as with her family problems. So because each teacher had a problem facing them, I think they were the perfect trio to have during a time like this, because it proved that I'm not alone, we're all in this together. Afterwards, we talked to the principal. So my middle school principal was pretty interesting. She was actually the person who founded the early college. So she was the principal of it for the first couple of years it existed. She didn't move to our school since it needed a principal. So when we told her this, she got really excited. She wished me good luck at early college and we took off to mom's school. Now comes the emotional part, emotional award. So this last day was much more emotional than any other last day of school because it marked the end of the toughest school year of my life. Mom knew this, so on the car ride back to her school, me and Mom talked a little bit about how crazy of a school year it was. We then got to March 8th. Mom started crying a little bit, but she wasn't crying because of what happened that day. She cried because of the outcome of that day. March 8th, the worst day of my life, paved the way for me to live the best days of my life, including the day I got saved. So just finishing 8th grade in general was a monumental accomplishment in itself. For pretty much the rest of the day, I was alone. I mostly screwed off in the computer lab at mom's school playing games. And that is 8th grade. Wow, that is one crazy school year. Never have I ever had a school year like this, and never will probably have another one like this again. I know that because I learned my lesson. 8th grade in particular was special in regards to other school years, not just because of what happened, but because of what the effects of what happened were. For most school years, I feel the effects for a few months, but don't normally affect me long term. 8th grade is different. Even now, I still feel the effects of 8th grade. Some of them I've already mentioned, such as the nightmares, going to early college, and mental therapy, but there are other multiple effects that still are in effect. Firstly, I think a good place to start is to talk about who I am today. So glaringly, a lot has changed in the past 3.5 years. I'm now 17 years old. I'm a senior at early college high school. I also have a lot going on in the next few months. In a month, I'll be graduating from early college, a semester earlier than everyone else. I'll explain how in a little bit in January. I'll explain a little bit. In January, I'll be moving away to university. However, even with all this stress I'm undergoing right now, I'm still living life to the fullest. Now, where are some of the other people mentioned in the story time today? How about we start off with the bullies? Where are they at? Well, I'm not entirely sure. However, I do know that the football has not played any football in high school. That's all I know. I haven't heard anything about him since 8th grade, and in all honesty, that's probably a good thing. As for Sir, well, last time I heard about him, he was in a mental asylum back in freshman year. I guess he started going crazy and just couldn't control himself. I've already confirmed that he's batshit crazy when I talked about him and why I call him sir, so, I mean, this really doesn't surprise me. However, I wish no bad on the bullies. I hope that they learned from their situation and applied it. So even though they did the worst things imaginable to me and said the worst things they could have ever said, I wish them well and I forgive them. However, there's still one person who I will not forgive. That was the man who sent me death threats. Unlike the bullies, I know very clearly where he is right now, as me and the YouTuber he sent death threats to still talk to this day. In the summer of 2019, he would turn on his friends, who obviously don't like that, so they joined forces with the YouTuber and managed to get his channel taken down. He had over 5,000 subscribers when his channel was terminated. Since then, he has now become a drunkard and overall a failure of a citizen. The YouTuber he had drama with is now 21 years old, and she's going to be graduating from art school next year. As for the friends, I know nothing about. However, all of us are pretty glad that this disgusting human being is off the internet. Some people should not be allowed to use the internet in my opinion. He is one of them. The Google Plus community now on Discord also turned against him. Now what about my teachers? Where are they at now? Well, I do not know about my English or Algebra teacher. However, I do know where both my science teachers were. My Earth Environmental Science teacher became a teacher at my school, early college. She teaches juniors chemistry. She came here before the 2020 to 2021 school year. Therefore, I actually had her for chemistry, and it was really cool having her for that class. My 8th grade science teacher followed a similar path to my Earth Environmental Science teacher, as she too came to early college. She teaches sophomores both Earth Environmental Science as well as biology. She came here back in August, so I didn't have her for another class, but we still talk very often, and she's doing very well, which I'm really happy for her. So where are the boys at? Well, Ryan and Robbie both go to the school we were supposed to go to. So of course I went to early college, therefore I no longer went to their school. However, we still maintain contact through YouTube and Discord. We also sometimes stream Pokemon Showdown together, although we haven't in a while because my computer is having problems with my mic. Both of them will be graduating high school in May 2022. Since we're on the topic of YouTube, let's talk about my YouTube channel. As mentioned, I took a 4-month break from YouTube after March 8th. However, I obviously came back. After all, if I left YouTube forever, I would not be recording this Storytime right now. But I came back in July 2018, but I implemented 3 restrictions on each of my videos. Firstly, there was no like to dislike ratio. Second, comments were disabled. Third, I only uploaded 1 video a week. The reason was to make sure the dude who sent death threats to me didn't do anything funny. I would keep these restrictions pretty consistently until June 2019. This is when that YouTuber lost his channel, so therefore, I uploaded 3 videos simultaneously. I also enabled comments in the like to dislike ratio. Even each video had 4 likes and 0 dislikes and 20 comments, every one of those comments being positive. So it seemed like I was in a safe zone. As a result, I removed those restrictions on all future videos. Another thing I'd like to mention is that it also kind of correlates with YouTube is writing. So I have been writing since February 2017, but it was January 2021 when I really began writing a lot when I began Storytime. The more I've done Storytime, the better quality I've released as well as more I've improved and distincted my writing style. 10 months later, and I'm now a far better writer than I ever thought I would be. Much of what I write involves events from 8th grade, the main event of course being March 8th. I write about this day a lot as a warning to those who read to not let their emotions take control of them. Otherwise, they may do stuff like what I did and let their emotions take control of them. Now let's talk about going back to my class schedule in 8th grade. Of course, I took 3 high school courses. Initially, I did not think getting ahead would have an impact. I thought I would still be disabled at everyone's level, and I thought I was just taking harder classes early. Well, junior year would be when I finally realized that these courses paid off. So a little over a week after the release of the original 8th grade Storytime on March 15th, 2021, me and Dad had a meeting with my high school counselor and college counselor to discuss my schedule for senior year. Due to taking those high school courses in 8th grade, I managed to get really far ahead. Like I was already taking trigonometry at the time, which is the highest math course early college allows students are offered. These counselors noticed this, and so they proposed an idea. I could graduate in December 2021 rather than in May 2022. This meant that I was going to need to prepare for college much sooner, but I was up for the challenge. Dad was too, so we agreed to it. Therefore, I will officially be graduating in 1 month, all because I took a few high school courses in middle school, which allowed me to take extra college courses in high school, so in the end, yes, it paid off. Now finally, let's talk about the future. So as stated, I'm going to be going off to college in 2 months. In 8th grade, I thought I would never get into college or even be successful, just because, I was depressed. Well, that was when I was depressed. After depression ended, I started to become more hopeful about the future. Because of that hope, I began setting myself to very high standards, which I still do today. Because of this, I have already been accepted at my dream school and will be beginning there in just 2 months. It will definitely be a strange time. Because of that, I will be taking an entire month of Storytime off. I'll go into more detail on that when we get there. Overall, 8th grade was a super difficult school year. However, this school year continues to influence me as a person even today, and it paid off in the end. So that's all I got for today's Storytime. Next week, on November 12th, 2021, I'll be talking about my experience at camp. Anyways,